The iron gates of Blackthorne Keep do not open for the condemned. They grind apart like jaws swallowing prey whole, and the man who walks through them does so knowing he will likely never leave. Duke Cassian Draven built his fortress to devour weakness, and every stone remembers the blood that paid for its construction. This is not a story about redemption or the softening of cruel men. This is about what happens when a predator finally recognizes something it cannot simply kill and forget. Stay with this until the darkness breaks, because some truths only reveal themselves when everything burns. But the morning Seraphina Vale arrived at Blackthorne, 3 bodies still hung from the eastern battlements. Cassian watched from his study window as the prison cart rattled across the drawbridge, wheels clattering against stone worn smooth by centuries of such processions. Morning fog clung to the cliffs like something alive, reluctant to release its hold on the fortress that commanded the northern territories with a grip far tighter than weather ever could. He did not move from the window, did not call for wine or summon advisors or perform any of the rituals that typically preceded an execution. Instead, he stood perfectly still, one hand resting against the cold glass, and studied the girl who emerged from the cart in chains, silver mourning silk. Not the coarse sackcloth prisoners typically wore, but actual silk that caught what little light struggled through the fog. Someone had made a statement dressing her that way. Perhaps her family's remaining servants. Perhaps she had done it herself. The thought interested him more than it should have. Behind Cassian, Chancellor Lucien Voss cleared his throat with the practiced delicacy of a man who had spent 20 years learning exactly how much noise the Duke tolerated during silence. Your Grace, the woman is secured in the lower hall. The executioner awaits your command. Cassian said nothing. Below, guards hauled Seraphina toward the entrance while she walked between them without stumbling, head raised despite the iron cuffs cutting into her wrists. She did not weep, did not beg, did not perform any of the expected theater-condemned prisoners usually offered before their final moments. Unusual, Cassian observed quietly. Lucien moved closer, hands clasped behind his back in that posture of concerned servitude he wore like armor. Your Grace, Lord Vale's treason was absolute. The evidence was irrefutable. He conspired with foreign enemies to destabilize the kingdom, to encourage rebellion among the southern houses, to undermine the very foundation of— I signed the execution order myself, Cassian interrupted without heat. I do not need the charges recited like a prayer. Of course. Lucian's voice dropped lower, softer. Though some at court question why the daughter was not immediately executed alongside the father, why transport her here at all when a blade in the capital dungeon would have been simpler, cleaner, less— Cassian turned from the window. The movement was slight, nothing more than a shift of weight and angle. But Lucien stopped speaking immediately, the rest of his sentence dying in his throat like something strangled. The Duke of Blackthorne did not need volume to dominate a room. His presence achieved that through sheer density of will. Tall but not massive, dark-haired but unremarkable in feature alone, Cassian Draven had built his reputation not on physical intimidation, but on the demonstrated willingness to destroy anything that displeased him without hesitation or regret. Men feared him because fear was rational. The alternative was dying surprised. You were saying, Chancellor. Lucien swallowed. I merely suggest that keeping her alive invites questions about your intentions, Your Grace. Questions that could be misinterpreted by rival houses seeking any perceived weakness to exploit. Then let them question. Cassian crossed to the desk where documents awaited his attention, each one a small decision that might alter lives or end them depending on his mood. Let them wonder why I deviate from expectation. Uncertainty breeds caution. Caution keeps them afraid. And what do you intend for the girl? Cassian picked up a letter bearing the seal of House Ravencroft, scanned its contents with the detached interest of someone reading about weather patterns, then set it aside unsigned. I intend to see what she does when given the opportunity to survive. Lucien's confusion was evident even in his silence. The Duke glanced up. You may go, Chancellor. Inform the court that I will address Lady Vale's situation personally. It took Lucien a long moment to find his voice again. As you command, Your Grace. The door closed with a whisper of expensive wood against stone. Alone, Cassian returned to the window where fog continued its retreat from morning sun. Below, Blackthorne Keep stretched across the cliff top like a scar, all black stone and sharp angles designed to remind visitors that mercy was an architectural impossibility here. His father had built this place, or rather his father had conquered it, murdered its previous occupants, and claimed the name Draven carried weight enough to justify atrocity. Cassian had been 7 years old when he watched his father hang 17 men from these same battlements for the crime of questioning a tax increase. The lesson had been clear. Power required brutality, and brutality required consistency. Love was the luxury of weaker men. Affection got you killed. Trust was just assassination waiting for convenient timing. Cassian had learned these truths the way other children learned reading or arithmetic, through repetition and consequence. By the time he inherited Blackthorne at 19 after his father choked on poisoned wine at a state dinner, Cassian understood that survival meant eliminating anyone who might mourn you enough to hesitate before saving themselves. He had spent the subsequent decade proving that understanding was not theoretical. Blackthorne Keep became synonymous with ruthless efficiency. Rebellions died before they spread. Conspiracies collapsed under interrogation. Noble houses that once treated the northern territories as provincial backwater learned to bow low and speak carefully whenever the Iron Duke turned his attention their direction. The kingdom functioned because Cassian Draven made it function, and it functioned through fear. Now, standing in his study watching morning burn away the last of the fog, Cassian found himself thinking about silver morning silk and a girl who refused to bow. Dangerous. He recognized danger the way wolves recognize the scent of fire, and still, he wanted to see what happened next. The Great Hall of Blackthorne Keep was designed to crush hope. Seraphina understood this immediately upon entering. Vaulted ceilings disappeared into shadow despite dozens of iron chandeliers burning overhead. Columns thick as ancient trees marched down both sides of the chamber, each one carved with scenes of historical violence rendered in obsessive detail. Banners hung from the walls displaying the Draven crest, a black wolf devouring a crown, silk worn thin by centuries of declaring that this house bowed to nothing. At the far end, elevated on a dais of polished obsidian, sat the throne. And in the throne sat the man who had killed her father. Seraphina walked forward between guards who gripped her arms with unnecessary force, boots echoing against stone, while courtiers lined both sides of the hall, watching her approach like spectators at an execution. Which, she supposed, was exactly what they expected this to be. She had spent the 3-day journey from the capital preparing for death, not with tears or hysterics or any of the weakness her tutors had trained out of her before she turned 10. The Vale family did not produce women who crumbled beneath pressure. They produced weapons disguised as daughters, sharp enough to navigate courts where men held all official power, but cunning enough to understand that influence operated through different channels entirely. Her father had taught her that power was not about who sat on thrones. It was about who whispered in their ears while they slept. He had also taught her that men like Duke Cassian Draven did not negotiate, did not compromise, and did not spare enemies under any circumstances, which made her continued survival deeply confusing. The guards halted 10 feet from the dais. One of them shoved her forward hard enough that she stumbled, chains rattling, and nearly fell to her knees on the stone floor. Nearly. Seraphina caught herself, straightened, and raised her eyes to meet the Duke's without flinching. The court inhaled collectively. Because looking directly at Cassian Draven was not done. Not by prisoners, not by visiting nobility, barely by his own ministers. You lowered your gaze and spoke when acknowledged and survived by remembering that the Iron Duke did not tolerate presumption. Seraphina looked at him anyway, and found herself surprised. She had expected a monster. Some scarred brute radiating cruelty through sheer physical menace, all bulk and violence and obvious threat. Instead, she saw a man probably 10 years her senior, dark-haired and clean-shaven, dressed in black and silver with the kind of austere elegance that suggested he did not need ornamentation to announce status. He sat motionless on the throne, one hand resting on the armrest, watching her with the focused intensity of a predator calculating exactly where to bite. His eyes were gray, storm cloud gray, empty of warmth, and currently fixed on her with an expression she could not interpret. Lady Seraphina Vale. The Duke's voice carried through the hall without effort, neither loud nor soft, just absolute. Daughter of the traitor Marcus Vale, who conspired with foreign enemies to destabilize this kingdom and undermine the crown's authority. Serafina said nothing. There was nothing to say. The charges were accurate. Her father had indeed conspired with foreign agents, had indeed coordinated with southern houses to encourage rebellion, had indeed been caught, tried, and executed within a week of discovery, all of which made her current survival utterly inexplicable. Your father was granted a trial, Cassian continued in that same measured tone. He was permitted counsel, allowed to present evidence, given every courtesy our laws provide. The verdict was unanimous. The sentence was just. Do you dispute these facts? No, Your Grace. Murmurs rippled through the watching courtiers. Apparently they had expected her to rage or weep or proclaim innocence. Instead, she confirmed her father's guilt without hesitation. Cassian's expression did not change. Do you deny knowledge of his conspiracies? I deny nothing, Your Grace. I knew what my father was doing. I helped him do it. The murmurs became gasps. Because admitting treason before the Iron Duke was not strategy. It was suicide. Serafina watched Cassian's face carefully, searching for any reaction, surprise, anger, satisfaction, anything. She saw nothing, just that same focused intensity, like he was examining something under glass and reaching conclusions she could not guess. You claim complicity in your father's treason. I claim truth, Your Grace. My father raised me to serve House Vale's interests. Those interests included alliances your policies opposed. We conspired. We failed. He died. Now I wait for you to complete the expected sequence. The hall fell completely silent. Even the guards flanking Serafina seemed to hold their breath. Cassian rose from the throne. The movement was fluid, economical, and somehow transformed the entire dynamic in the chamber. He descended the dais steps slowly, each footfall deliberate, until he stood directly in front of her, close enough that she could see the absolute absence of mercy in his eyes. You believe I brought you here to execute you, he said quietly, that I transported you 3 days across winter roads and dragged you before my court simply to indulge theatrical cruelty. Serafina forced herself to maintain eye contact despite every instinct screaming to look away. Yes, Your Grace, I assumed you intended to make an example, perhaps a public beheading, perhaps something worse. Men like you do not leave loose threads. Men like me. Ruthless men, Your Grace. Practical men. The kind who understand that sentiment is expensive and enemies should be eliminated completely. Something flickered across Cassian's face. Not quite amusement, not quite interest. Something between the two that made Serafina's pulse quicken despite her best efforts at control. You speak bluntly for someone in chains. Lies seem pointless now, Your Grace. Cassian studied her for a long moment. Then, without warning, he reached forward and grabbed the chains between her wrists, metal links clinking as he lifted them slightly. Serafina went rigid, but the Duke did not drag her or strike her or perform any of the violence she had braced for. Instead, he examined the iron cuffs with something that might have been curiosity, turning her wrist slightly to see where the metal had worn her skin raw. These do not suit you, he said finally. Then he released the chains and turned to the nearest guard. Remove them. Your Grace, the guard stammered. She is a confessed traitor. Protocol requires, I am protocol. Cassian interrupted without heat. Remove them, now. The guard fumbled with his keys while the court watched in stunned silence. Serafina stood frozen, trying to understand what was happening, what game this was, what trap she had triggered by being honest when dishonesty might have been safer. The cuffs fell away with a metallic clatter against stone. Serafina rubbed her wrists automatically, feeling blood return to her hands in painful tingles. She looked up at the Duke, confusion breaking through her careful composure for the first time since entering the hall. Why? Cassian turned away from her, already walking back toward the throne like the matter was settled. Because, Lady Vale, I find your candor refreshing. Most prisoners either grovel or defiant posture badly. You did neither. You confirmed guilt, explained reasoning, and waited for consequences without begging. That interests me more than executing you would satisfy me. He resumed his seat with that same fluid economy of movement. Therefore, you will remain at Blackthorne Keep as my guest. You will be provided chambers, clothing, and access to the court under supervision. You will not leave the fortress grounds without permission. You will report any contact from southern houses or foreign agents immediately. In return, you will keep your life and maintain the dignity your father's legacy does not deserve." The hall erupted. Nobles shouted over each other. Ministers turned to one another with expressions ranging from outrage to confusion. Somewhere near the back, someone dropped a ceremonial sword with a clatter that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. Serafina barely heard any of it. She stared at the Duke with the certainty that she had just become something far more dangerous than a prisoner awaiting execution. She had become the Iron Duke's deliberate mystery. And in Blackthorne Keep, mysteries always ended in blood. The chambers they gave Serafina occupied the South Tower, 4 floors above the courtyard where prisoners typically screamed during interrogations. She stood at the window watching sunset paint the cliffs orange and red while servants unpacked trunks of clothing she did not recognize. Expensive gowns, formal silks, nothing like the morning dress she had worn to her own would-be execution. Someone knocked softly on the door. A woman entered without waiting for invitation. Older, perhaps 50, dressed in the severe black that marked her as upper household staff. She carried herself with the rigid posture of someone accustomed to authority in spaces where official power was male, but practical control was female. "Lady Vale, I am Mistress Ashford, head of the Duke's household. I oversee all domestic arrangements within Blackthorne Keep. You will report to me regarding daily schedules, dietary preferences, and any material needs. You will not wander the fortress without escort. You will attend court functions when summoned. You will comport yourself with the understanding that His Grace's mercy is not permission for presumption." Serafina turned from the window. "Am I a guest or a prisoner, Mistress Ashford?" The older woman's expression did not flicker. "You are whatever His Grace decides you are on any given morning, my lady. I suggest behaving as though both possibilities remain equally likely." With that, she departed, leaving Serafina alone with servants who unpacked in careful silence and gowns that cost more than some houses earned in a year. Later, after the servants left and darkness pressed against the windows like something physical, Serafina sat on the edge of an absurdly comfortable bed and tried to understand what had happened. The Duke should have killed her. Every strategic calculation said execution was correct. She had confessed treason, admitted complicity, provided no useful intelligence and no reason to waste resources on her survival. Yet here she was, installed in luxury, granted conditional freedom, and displayed before the court like some prize Cassian Draven had claimed for reasons no one understood, including, she suspected, the Duke himself. That uncertainty frightened her more than execution would have, because Serafina Vale had spent her entire life learning to read powerful men, to predict their moves, to understand their motivations well enough to survive in their world. But when she looked into Cassian Draven's storm-gray eyes, she saw nothing she recognized, just hunger wearing the mask of curiosity, and the absolute certainty that whatever he wanted from her, whatever had stayed his hand today, would cost more than simple death ever could. Starts. The first week passed in surreal suspension. Serafina attended court functions flanked by guards who never touched her, but never left her alone. She dined in the Great Hall at a table reserved for minor nobility, neither honored nor humiliated, simply present. She walked the fortress gardens when permitted, always supervised, always watched by 100 eyes that whispered the moment she passed. The nobles of Blackthorne treated her like a ghost, not quite real, not quite trustworthy. Something between prisoner and guest that defied the rigid social hierarchy everyone else navigated with practiced ease. She did not speak unless spoken to. She did not initiate conversation. She observed. And what she observed was a court operating on fear so fundamental it had become invisible to those living inside it. Ministers delivered reports to the Duke with voices carefully drained of emotion. Nobles laughed at his rare observations regardless of whether they were humorous. Servants moved through the halls like shadows, never making eye contact, never hesitating, never drawing attention that might prove fatal on the wrong day. Everyone at Blackthorne Keep existed in a permanent state of controlled terror. Everyone except Cassian himself. The Duke attended to governance with mechanical efficiency. He heard petitions for hours without visible fatigue. He reviewed military reports with focus that missed nothing. He signed documents, rejected proposals, approved budgets, ordered arrests, and commuted sentences with the emotional investment of someone sorting correspondence. And occasionally, when he thought no one was watching, his gaze would drift to wherever Serafina happened to be standing. She felt those moments like physical weight. On the 8th day, Chancellor Lucian approached her in the library, where she had been reading histories of the Northern Territories. Lady Vale. He smiled with practiced warmth that did not reach his eyes. I trust you are finding your accommodations acceptable? Seraphina marked her place and closed the book. They are generous beyond expectation, Chancellor. His grace is nothing if not generous to those who earn his favor. Lucian sat in the chair opposite hers, arranging his robes with fussy precision. Though I confess, many at court remain perplexed by his decision regarding your status here. As am I, Chancellor. Are you? Lucian's smile sharpened slightly. Or do you perhaps understand more than you pretend? You are your father's daughter, after all. Marcus Vale was many things, but foolish was not among them. He taught you courtcraft from childhood. Perhaps he also taught you how to manipulate powerful men through strategic vulnerability. Seraphina held his gaze steadily. If you believe I manipulated the Duke into sparing me, Chancellor, you credit me with influence I do not possess. His Grace makes his own decisions. I am merely attempting to survive them. Of course. Lucian stood, already retreating toward the door. Still, you might remember that His Grace's protection extends only as far as his interest. An interest, Lady Vale, is notoriously temporary in Blackthorne Keep. He left her alone with histories and growing certainty that whatever game was being played here, she understood less than she needed to survive it. The breaking point came during the Winter Sovereign Ball preparations. Seraphina had been summoned to the Great Hall where servants transformed the space into something that almost resembled celebration. Banners replaced battle standards, musicians practiced in corners. Tables groaned under the weight of imported delicacies, meant to impress foreign ambassadors who would attend the annual display of Blackthorne's wealth and power. She stood near the western windows watching the controlled chaos when someone cleared their throat behind her. Lady Vale? She turned to find Duke Cassian himself standing close enough that propriety would have demanded she step back. She did not step back. Your Grace? You have been avoiding me, he observed without inflection. I have been giving you no reason to notice me, Your Grace. There is a difference. Something that might have been amusement flickered across his features. You believe obscurity is survival. I believe drawing attention in your court is usually fatal, Your Grace. Usually. Cassian shifted slightly, angling himself so they both faced the windows instead of each other. The posture was almost casual, almost comfortable. But I asked you here today because I want your opinion on something. Seraphina blinked. My opinion, Your Grace? The Winter Ball celebrates Blackthorne's dominance over the Northern Territories. It reminds the kingdom that this house does not beg for power. We take it and dare others to object. But lately, I find myself questioning whether intimidation remains as effective as tradition claims. Seraphina studied his profile carefully. You want me to tell you whether fear still works as governance? I want you to tell me what you see when you look at this court. She should have deflected, should have offered some diplomatic nothing that praised his rule while committing to no actual analysis. Instead, she heard herself speaking with the same blunt honesty that had nearly gotten her executed on her first day. I see a kingdom held together by terror, Your Grace. I see nobles who calculate every word before speaking it. I see ministers who would rather die than disappoint you. I see a fortress where everyone performs loyalty so desperately that actual loyalty has become impossible to distinguish from strategic survival. The silence stretched between them. Cassian did not move, did not react, just continued staring out at the cliffs where winter storms gathered like the obsidian stone welcomed them. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than she had ever heard it. And when you look at me, Lady Vale, what do you see? Seraphina's breath caught. Because this was not a political question. This was something else entirely. Something that felt dangerously like genuine curiosity from a man who had spent decades ensuring no one ever got close enough to wonder about him. I see someone who learned very young that caring about anything makes you weak, she said slowly. I see someone who built an empire on ruthlessness because mercy got people he loved killed. I see someone powerful and completely alone who has convinced himself that loneliness is strength. Cassian turned to face her fully. His expression remained unreadable, but his eyes, those storm-gray eyes, held something she had not seen before. Recognition. Like she had named something he had never allowed himself to acknowledge. You are either very brave or very foolish, Lady Vale. I think, Your Grace, that I am simply tired of pretending I do not see what is obvious. And what is obvious? That you spared me not because I am useful, not because I represent strategic value. You spared me because for the first time in years, someone looked at you without fear or ambition, and you wanted to understand what that felt like. The admission hung between them like something fragile. Then Cassian did something that shocked Serafina more than anything else that had happened since her arrival. He smiled. Not the cold, dismissive expression he occasionally deployed at court, a real smile. Small and fleeting and gone almost before it fully formed, but genuine. Dangerous girl, he murmured, and walked away, leaving her standing by the windows with the certainty that she had just crossed a line from which there was no retreat. Because the Iron Duke did not smile at prisoners. He smiled at equals, and in Blackthorne Keep, equals were the most endangered species of all. That night, Serafina could not sleep. She paced her chambers while storm winds howled against the tower walls and rain hammered the windows like something demanding entry. Somewhere below, the fortress continued its endless nocturnal operations. Guards changing shifts, servants preparing morning meals, ministers reviewing documents by candlelight because the Duke's business never truly stopped. She had survived 2 weeks at Blackthorne, 2 weeks of careful invisibility punctuated by moments of reckless honesty that should have gotten her killed. Instead, she had gained the Duke's attention. No, she had gained his interest, and Serafina understood with absolute certainty that Cassian Draven's interest was more dangerous than his hatred could ever be. Because hatred was clean. Hatred was simple. You knew where you stood with someone who wanted you dead, but interest was complicated. Interest meant he was studying her, wondering about her, testing to see what she would do or say next. Interest meant he was starting to see her as something other than a political problem to eliminate. And in a world where the Iron Duke trusted nothing and no one, that transformation carried implications that terrified her more than any threat of execution. Someone knocked on her door. Serafina froze. Visitors after midnight were not normal, were not safe. She moved to the door slowly, hand trembling slightly as she reached for the handle. A guard stood in the corridor, expression carefully neutral. Lady Vale, His Grace requests your presence in the private study. Immediately. Every instinct Serafina possessed screamed warning, but refusing a Duke's summons was not an option that ended well. She nodded once. Lead the way. The fortress at night was a different creature than during daylight hours. Shadows pooled in corners like living things. Torches burned low in their sconces, casting more darkness than illumination. Their footsteps echoed through empty corridors where stone walls remembered centuries of secrets and violence. They climbed stairs, turned down passages Serafina did not recognize, moved deeper into sections of Blackthorne she had not been permitted to explore. Finally, the guards stopped before a heavy oak door, knocked twice, and departed without another word. Serafina stood alone in the hallway, heart pounding, knowing that whatever waited beyond this door would change everything. She pushed it open. The study was smaller than she expected. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling. A fire burned in the hearth, throwing orange light across furniture worn comfortable by use rather than chosen for display. Maps covered one table. Documents littered another. And Duke Cassian Draven stood by the window with his back to the door, still dressed despite the late hour, staring out at the storm like he was trying to read meaning in the lightning. Close the door, Lady Vale. She did. The latch clicked with finality. Cassian did not turn around. Do you know why I brought you here tonight? No, Your Grace, because I find myself in unfamiliar territory. He finally faced her, and the expression on his features was something between confusion and fury. I have spent 15 years ensuring that nothing in this kingdom surprises me. I eliminate threats before they develop. I control variables before they become problems. I maintain absolute certainty about every element in my domain. He moved closer. And then you arrived. Confessed treason. Survived execution. Looked at me without fear. Spoke truths no one else dares acknowledge. And now I cannot stop thinking about what you said today. That I spared you because someone finally looked at me without calculation. Serafina's pulse hammered in her throat. Your Grace, Do not apologize. Cassian stopped directly in front of her. Do not deflect. Just tell me something. When you look at me now in private, without guards or witnesses or the performance of court, what do you actually see? The question was a trap. Every answer was wrong. Every answer was dangerous. Serafina met his eyes anyway, and spoke the truth that would probably destroy her. I see a man who has forgotten what it feels like to be seen as human instead of a weapon. I see someone who built walls so high that even he cannot climb over them anymore. I see loneliness so profound that you have convinced yourself it is strength. And I see someone who is terrified that I might be the first person in years who actually understands that. The silence was absolute. Cassian stared at her with an intensity that felt like physical pressure. Then, with a movement so sudden she barely tracked it, he closed the remaining distance between them, grabbed her face in both hands, and the door burst open. Chancellor Lucian stood in the threshold, flanked by guards, expression a perfect mask of urgent concern. Your Grace, forgive the intrusion, but there has been an incident. The Southern Houses have sent an urgent communication demanding immediate response. Lord Ravencroft threatens withdrawal from the territorial agreements unless— Get out, Cassian said quietly. Lucian hesitated. Your Grace, the situation is— Out! The word was not shouted, barely even raised, but it carried such concentrated violence that Lucian actually stumbled backward. The guards fled. Lucian followed, pulling the door closed behind him. Serafina stood frozen where Cassian had released her, breathing hard, mind racing through what had almost happened and what it meant and why the Chancellor had interrupted at precisely that moment. The Duke returned to the window, shoulders rigid, hands clenched into fists at his sides. You should go, Lady Vale. Serafina did not move. Your Grace, go. She left, walked through midnight corridors alone because apparently the guards had not waited, climbed the tower stairs to her chambers, closed and locked the door, and stood in the darkness trying to process the fact that Duke Cassian Draven, the Iron Duke who trusted nothing and feared no one, had almost kissed her, had almost revealed something real beneath all the calculated cruelty, had almost proven that Serafina Vale was not imagining the dangerous current that ran between them whenever they occupied the same space. Outside, the storm reached its peak. Thunder shook the tower walls, and Serafina understood with absolute certainty that she was no longer trying to survive Blackthorne Keep. She was trying to survive the moment when the most ruthless man in the kingdom stopped pretending she was just another political problem and acknowledged what they both already knew, that predators do not study prey this carefully unless they intend to keep it forever. This is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes only. Morning arrived at Blackthorne Keep the way it always did, with cold precision and the certainty that survival depended on reading the Duke's mood before breakfast ended. Serafina descended to the Great Hall expecting whispers. She got silence instead, the kind that pressed against eardrums and made every footstep sound like confession. Nobles hunched over their plates, pretending fascination with food they barely touched. Ministers spoke in undertones that died the moment she passed. Even the servants moved with exaggerated caution, as though the entire fortress had collectively decided that drawing attention was now a capital offense. She took her usual seat at the lower table reserved for minor nobility and guests, whose status remained deliberately ambiguous. The Duke's chair sat empty. Unusual. Cassian attended every meal with the mechanical consistency of a man for whom routine was control and control was survival. His absence felt like a missing tooth. Not painful exactly, but impossible to ignore. Lady Vale. Serafina looked up to find Mistress Ashford standing beside her chair with that expression of severe neutrality that revealed absolutely nothing. His Grace requests you attend him in the map room following breakfast. A guard will escort you. The words carried through the hall despite being spoken quietly. Serafina felt every eye in the room lock onto her with the collective intensity of spectators watching someone walk toward the gallows. Of course, Mistress Ashford. The older woman departed without another word, leaving Serafina alone with food she could no longer taste, and the growing certainty that last night's interrupted moment had consequences she did not yet understand. She forced herself to eat anyway, forced herself to move slowly, to betray nothing, to maintain the careful composure that had kept her alive this long. But her hand shook slightly as she lifted her cup, and across the hall, Chancellor Lucian watched with the satisfied expression of a man who had just moved a decisive piece on a board only he could see. The map room occupied the fortress's eastern wing, a space dominated by a table the size of a small house, where military campaigns were planned and territorial disputes were settled through ink instead of blood. Usually. Serafina entered to find Cassian standing over that table, both hands braced against its edge, staring down at a map of the northern territories with focus so intense it felt like violence looking for direction. He did not look up when she entered. "Close the door, Lady Vale." She did. The click of the latch sounded obscenely loud in the silence. Cassian still did not look at her. "Do you know what the worst part of last night was?" Serafina's throat felt tight. "No, Your Grace." Not the interruption, not the Southern House's manufacturing crisis to disrupt my attention, not even Lucian's perfectly timed intrusion. He finally raised his eyes to meet hers, and the expression there was something between fury and exhaustion. "The worst part was realizing that you were right." "About what, Your Grace?" "About everything." He straightened, moving around the table with the controlled precision of someone using movement to burn off energy that had nowhere else to go. "About the loneliness, about the walls, about forgetting what it feels like to be seen as human instead of a weapon people point at problems they want destroyed." "Your Grace, do not interrupt me." The words were quiet, but absolute. "I brought you here this morning because we are going to establish rules. Boundaries. The framework within which this," he gestured vaguely between them, "whatever this is, will operate. Because I do not operate without rules, Lady Vale. Rules are what separate governance from chaos." Serafina forced herself to stand still despite every instinct screaming to either flee or move closer. "What rules did you have in mind?" "First, you will stop looking at me like you can see through every defense I have spent 15 years constructing. It is unacceptable and unsettling and makes me want to do things that would horrify this entire court. Second, you will maintain appropriate distance in public, no conversations that could be misinterpreted, no eye contact that lasts longer than propriety permits. The nobles here are vultures. They smell weakness the way corpses smell rot. Third," he paused, jaw working like the next words cost something to produce, "you will tell me immediately if I make you uncomfortable, if my attention becomes burden instead of curiosity, because I will not be the kind of man who mistakes possession for affection." The admission landed between them like something fragile. Serafina took a careful breath. "And if I told you right now that your attention terrifies me, Your Grace, what would you do?" Cassian's expression did not change. "I would increase your guard detail, restrict your movements to ensure no harm came to you, and never speak to you privately again. You would remain safe, comfortable, and completely untouchable for as long as you stayed at Blackthorne. That is not what I asked. No." His voice dropped lower. "You asked what I would do. The truth is, I would hate every moment of your fear, blame myself for causing it, and still enforce those restrictions because your safety matters more than my preferences. That is what separates me from monsters, Lady Vale. Monsters do not care about consent. I do." Serafina found herself moving forward without conscious decision. 3 steps, then 5, until she stood close enough to see the tension in his shoulders, the exhaustion around his eyes, the evidence that last night had cost him sleep the same way it had stolen hers. "You want rules, Your Grace?" "Yes." "Then here is mine. Stop pretending that caring about someone makes you weak. It does not. It makes you human. And human is not the same as vulnerable." Cassian stared at her like she had just spoken a language he almost recognized but could not quite translate. "You do not understand what you are asking." His voice was rough, unsteady. "Everything I have built here requires absolute control, absolute certainty. The moment I allow emotion to influence decisions, people die. Territories fall. The kingdom collapses into the same chaos my father drowned in before poison finally killed him." "Then do not let emotion influence your decisions," Serafina said quietly. "Let it influence your life. There is a difference." The silence stretched between them like a wire pulled too tight. Then Cassian did something that shocked her more than anything else that morning. He laughed, not the cold, dismissive sound he occasionally deployed at court. A real laugh, short and bitter and completely genuine. "You're going to destroy me, Lady Vale, only if you let me, Your Grace. His hand lifted, slowly, giving her time to pull away, and touched her face with the kind of careful precision usually reserved for handling explosives. His thumb traced her cheekbone while his eyes searched hers for something she could not name. "I do not know how to do this," he admitted. "How to want someone without consuming them. How to care without controlling. My entire life has been about taking what I need and eliminating threats before they eliminate me." "Then learn," Serafina whispered. "You are the most powerful man in the Northern Territories. Surely you can figure out how to be gentle occasionally." Something shifted in Cassian's expression. Some internal decision reached and executed before she could track its formation. His other hand came up to frame her face, and this time, no one interrupted. The kiss was not gentle, was not soft or tentative or any of the things romantic poetry claimed such moments should be. It was raw and desperate, and tasted like someone drowning, finally finding air. Serafina's hands fisted in his shirt automatically, pulling him closer despite every rational thought screaming that this was dangerous, this was insane, this was the exact kind of complication that got people killed in places like Blackthorne Keep. She kissed him back anyway, because somewhere between arriving in chains and standing in this map room being touched like she was something precious instead of expendable, Serafina Vale had stopped trying to survive Duke Cassian Draven and started trying to understand him. And understanding, she was learning, was far more dangerous than simple survival ever could be. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Cassian rested his forehead against hers with his eyes closed. "This changes nothing about the danger you are in," he said quietly. "If anything, it makes you more vulnerable. Every enemy I have will see you as leverage. Every ambitious noble will view you as a weakness to exploit. Staying close to me might be the most dangerous decision you have ever made." Serafina's hands were still tangled in his shirt. "Then I suppose we had better make sure I am worth the risk, Your Grace." He opened his eyes and smiled, not the cold expression he showed the court. Something real and unguarded and gone almost immediately, replaced by the careful mask he wore like armor. "Back to Lady Vale in public," he said, pulling away with visible effort. "Serafina, only when we are alone, and we are alone as rarely as possible until I can ensure your safety." She nodded, understanding the calculation even if part of her wanted to argue against it. Cassian moved back to the table, already rebuilding the distance between them, already returning to the role he wore so completely that most people forgot it was a performance. "The Winter Sovereign Ball is in 3 days. You will attend as my personal guest. I will announce your official status as a ward under ducal protection. It will formalize your position here and make clear that harming you means declaring war on Blackthorne itself. And after the ball? After the ball, we see who is foolish enough to test whether I mean what I say." The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation and mounting tension. Serafina was measured for gowns she did not choose. Jewels appeared in her chambers without explanation. Mistress Ashford delivered instruction on court protocol and ball etiquette with the grim efficiency of someone preparing a soldier for combat, because that was exactly what the Winter Sovereign Ball represented. Combat dressed as celebration, violence wrapped in silk and presented with wine. The nobles arrived in waves throughout the second day. Minor houses seeking favor, major houses displaying strength, foreign ambassadors calculating advantage. Everyone performing loyalty while quietly assessing whether the Duke's grip on power showed any signs of weakening. Serafina watched from her tower window as carriages rolled through the gates bearing crests she recognized from her father's lessons. House Ravencroft, House Thornfield, House Blackwood. Each one a potential ally or enemy, depending on how winds shifted and which direction offered better survival odds. Her father had taught her that nobility was just organized predation with better table manners. Looking down at the arriving guests, she understood exactly what he meant. Someone knocked on her door. She opened it to find Chancellor Lucian standing in the corridor with that expression of concerned civility that never quite reached his eyes. "Lady Vale, might I have a moment of your time?" Serafina stepped aside, allowing him entry despite every instinct warning against it. Lucian moved to the window, hands clasped behind his back, studying the courtyard below with apparent fascination. "You have made quite an impression on His Grace. I was not aware that making impressions was within my power, Chancellor. Do not be modest." He turned to face her fully. "The Duke has not shown this much personal interest in anyone since, well, Since ever, truthfully. It is remarkable and concerning. Concerning how? Lucian's smile was a masterpiece of diplomatic insincerity. His Grace is a brilliant ruler, ruthless when necessary, strategic always, capable of maintaining order through sheer force of will. But he is also human, Lady Vale. And humans have weaknesses. Attachment, for instance, affection, the kind of emotions that cloud judgment and make even the strongest men vulnerable. Serafina kept her expression carefully neutral. You believe I am a weakness. I believe you could become one. If the Duke allows personal feelings to influence policy, rival houses will exploit that vulnerability without hesitation. If foreign powers sense emotional compromise, they will test our borders. If the court perceives their ruler as distracted by a woman, particularly the daughter of a traitor, unrest becomes inevitable. He moved closer. I am telling you this not as threat, Lady Vale, but as warning, for your own safety as much as His Grace's stability. The winter ball will display you before every ambitious noble in the kingdom. They will see how he looks at you, how you look at him, and they will begin planning accordingly. Planning what, Chancellor? How to remove you. Whether through scandal, accusation, or more permanent methods. Lucian's tone remained pleasant throughout, like he was discussing weather instead of assassination. I would hate to see you harmed simply because the Duke forgot that caring about someone makes them a target. The threat was clear despite the diplomatic packaging. Serafina met his eyes steadily. Thank you for the warning, Chancellor. I will keep it in mind. Please do. He moved toward the door, then paused. One more thing. His Grace may be ruthless, but he is not cruel. If you truly care about his well-being, consider whether your presence here helps or harms him. Sometimes the greatest act of loyalty is knowing when to disappear. He left before she could respond. Serafina stood alone in her chambers, heart pounding, mind racing through implications and threats, and the growing certainty that Chancellor Lucien was far more dangerous than his helpful demeanor suggested. Because men who delivered warnings wrapped in concern were usually the same men planning the violence they claimed to fear. The night of the winter sovereign ball arrived with the weight of storms gathering. Serafina stood before a mirror in her chambers, wearing a gown that cost more than most houses earned in a decade. Deep emerald silk that caught light like something alive. Jewelry that whispered wealth in every glittering stone. Hair arranged in elaborate braids that took 2 servants 3 hours to complete. She looked like nobility, felt like bait. Mistress Ashford entered without knocking, surveyed her with critical efficiency, and nodded once. You will do, Lady Vale. Remember what I taught you. Eyes down unless His Grace addresses you directly. Speak only when spoken to. Do not wander. Do not drink more than 2 glasses of wine. Do not under any circumstances allow yourself to be alone with any male guest. I understand. I doubt that, my lady. But you will learn quickly or not survive the night. The older woman's expression softened fractionally. His Grace has enemies who would delight in seeing you harmed simply to wound him. Stay close to the guards I assign you. Trust no one. Not even you, Mistress Ashford. Especially not me. She moved toward the door. I serve Blackthorne Keep, not individuals. My loyalty is to the fortress itself. If your presence threatens its stability, I will remove you myself. The honesty was almost refreshing. 2 guards appeared to escort her downstairs. They moved through corridors already filling with guests, past nobles who turned to stare with expressions ranging from curiosity to calculation, downstairs that seemed to descend forever before finally reaching the great hall. The transformation was staggering. Blackthorne's brutal architecture had been softened by thousands of candles, silk banners, flower arrangements that must have cost a fortune to import during winter. Musicians filled the space with orchestral grandeur that almost drowned the underlying tension. Masked nobles swirled across the floor in dances that looked beautiful and felt like combat. And at the far end, elevated on his dais, Duke Cassian Draven presided over it all like a king holding court in enemy territory. He wore black and silver, formal and severe, with the Draven wolf displayed prominently across his chest. No mask despite the ball's tradition. No concession to celebration, just that same focused intensity she had come to recognize, directed now at managing a room full of potential threats. Their eyes met across the crowded hall. Something electric passed between them, even at this distance. Then someone blocked her view. Lady Seraphina Vale. Lord Ravenscroft stood before her with a smile that did not reach his eyes, wearing crimson velvet and enough jewelry to fund a small army. What a delight to finally make your acquaintance. Your father and I were quite close before his unfortunate demise. The words were chosen to wound. Seraphina kept her expression serene. I am certain my father valued your friendship, Lord Ravenscroft. Oh, I doubt that. His smile sharpened. Marcus Vale valued very little beyond his own advancement, a trait you seem to have inherited, given your current situation. My current situation involves grief and survival, my lord. Nothing more complex than that. Ravenscroft leaned closer, voice dropping to a whisper meant only for her. Be careful, little Vale. The Duke may find you amusing now, but His Grace has a well-documented history of discarding toys once he grows bored. And when that happens, you will have no family, no allies, and no protection from those of us who remember your father's treachery. He moved away before she could respond, melting back into the crowd like poison dispersing through water. Seraphina's hands trembled. She forced them still, forced herself to breathe, forced herself to remember that men like Ravenscroft traded in intimidation because direct violence was more complicated. A hand touched her elbow. She turned to find Cassian standing beside her, expression carefully neutral, but eyes burning with barely controlled fury. Lord Ravenscroft forgets himself, he said quietly, approaching you without permission, speaking to you without introduction, breathing the same air you breathe without my explicit consent. Your Grace, I can handle— You should not have to. His grip on her elbow tightened fractionally. And you will not. Not anymore. He turned to address the room without raising his voice. The entire hall fell silent anyway. Because when the Duke of Blackthorne wanted attention, physics itself seemed to bend toward giving it to him. The Winter Sovereign Ball celebrates our dominance over the Northern Territories. It reminds the kingdom that House Draven does not beg for power. We take it and dare others to object. This year, I have decided to add an element to that tradition. He pulled Seraphina forward, positioning her beside him on the dais where everyone could see. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Lady Seraphina Vale is hereby declared a ward under my personal protection. Any insult directed at her is an insult directed at me. Any threat against her is a declaration of war against Blackthorne itself. Any man foolish enough to test whether I mean these words will learn very quickly that I have never made empty threats in my life. The hall remained frozen. Nobles exchanged glances. Ministers whispered. Foreign ambassadors leaned toward their advisors with expressions that calculated exactly how this changed every political equation they had previously assumed stable. Chancellor Lucian stood near the back wearing a smile that looked like it had been carved from ice. Cassian continued without acknowledging any of it. Let me be absolutely clear. Lady Vale is under my protection not because of her father's legacy, but despite it. She has committed no crime, participated in no conspiracy. Her presence here is by my command and my will alone. Anyone who suggests otherwise can explain their concerns to me personally. He let that threat hang in the air for a long moment. Then he descended from the dais, pulling Seraphina with him, and led her onto the dance floor while musicians scrambled to begin a waltz. You did not have to do that, she whispered as he positioned them for the dance. Yes, I did. His hand settled on her waist with possessive certainty. Ravenscroft was testing boundaries. I needed to establish that there are no boundaries to test. You are not negotiable, Seraphina. Not for political advantage, not for social stability, not for anything. They began moving through the steps while every eye in the room tracked their progress. You just made me the most dangerous woman in your court, she pointed out. Good. His expression remained neutral, but his voice held something darker. Let them see exactly what happens when someone I care about gets threatened. Let them understand that my protection is not symbolic. And let every ambitious fool in this room realize that harming you means facing me at my absolute worst. The waltz continued. Nobles resumed their own dances, conversations, political calculations. But Seraphina felt the weight of their attention like physical pressure, because Cassian had just declared war on her behalf, had just drawn a line in marble and stone and dared the entire kingdom to cross it, had just proven that the ruthless Duke everyone feared was capable of something far more terrifying than strategic violence. He was capable of devotion. And devoted predators were the most dangerous creatures alive. The attack came 3 hours into the ball, not with blades or poison or any of the obvious methods Serafina Yina had been trained to watch for. It came with words. A visiting ambassador from the southern provinces rose during the formal toasts, wine glass held high, expression perfectly diplomatic. To our gracious host, Duke Draven, whose strength maintains order throughout the northern territories. May his judgment remain as sharp as his reputation suggests, unclouded by sentiment or distraction. The toast landed like accusation wrapped in courtesy. Cassian's expression did not change. He raised his own glass with mechanical precision. To clarity. And to ensuring that anyone who mistakes mercy for weakness learns the difference before making that mistake permanent. The ambassador smiled, took his seat, and Serafina watched Chancellor Lucian lean toward him with a whisper that made both men glance her direction. The conspiracy was forming in real time. She could see it taking shape through exchanged glances and subtle nods, and the way certain nobles began gravitating toward each other like magnets drawn by shared purpose. They were going to move against her. Not tonight. Too obvious. Too risky. But soon. And when they did, Cassian would be forced to choose between protecting her and maintaining the brutal political stability that kept the kingdom functioning. Serafina excused herself quietly, moving toward the corridor that led to the gardens where she could think without hundreds of eyes tracking her every movement. The night air was cold enough to burn. She stood in the courtyard where frost made everything glitter like broken glass, trying to process the implications of what she had just witnessed. Cassian had made her untouchable by decree, but decrees only worked when the man issuing them could enforce them. And if enough houses united in opposition, even the Iron Duke would struggle to maintain absolute control, which meant her presence here was about to spark exactly the kind of instability Lucian had warned against, which meant she had become the weakness the Chancellor predicted. Footsteps behind her. She turned expecting guards and found Cassian instead, still wearing his formal blacks, face carved from shadows and moonlight. You left without your escort. I needed air, Your Grace. He moved closer, studying her expression with that focused intensity that missed nothing. What did you see in there? The truth? Serafina wrapped her arms around herself against the cold. I saw men planning to destroy me in order to wound you. I saw the beginning of a conspiracy that will force you to choose between protecting me and maintaining your grip on power. I saw exactly what Lucian warned me about coming true. Cassian's jaw tightened. Lucian spoke to you? This afternoon. He was very concerned about your judgment becoming clouded by attachment. Very helpful in explaining all the ways my presence here threatens your stability. Of course he was. Cassian's voice went flat. Dangerous. Lucien has spent years positioning himself as my most trusted advisor, the indispensable voice of reason. He likely sees you as competition for influence he believes belongs to him. Or he sees me as exactly what I am, a liability, a weakness. The daughter of a traitor who somehow talked her way into your protection and is now about to trigger exactly the kind of internal rebellion you built this fortress to prevent. Stop. The word was quiet but absolute. You are not a liability, you are not a weakness, and you did not talk your way into anything. I chose to spare you. I chose to keep you here. I chose to stand before my entire court tonight and declare you untouchable. Those were my decisions, made for my reasons, and I do not regret any of them. Serafina turned to face him fully. Even if they cost you everything? Cassian closed the distance between them with 2 long strides. His hands framed her face with that same careful precision, like she was something that might break if handled roughly. Listen to me very carefully, Serafina. I have spent 15 years building an empire on ruthlessness and fear. I have executed conspirators, crushed rebellions, and eliminated threats with the kind of cold efficiency that keeps people awake at night wondering if they are next. I am very good at what I do. Exceptionally good. And part of being that good means knowing exactly when the cost of something exceeds its strategic value. He paused. You are worth the cost. Whatever happens next, whoever moves against us, whatever instability follows, you are worth it. Do you understand? The admission was terrifying in its sincerity. Serafina's hands came up to cover his. Your enemies will use me against you. Let them try. They will force you to choose. Then I choose you. His voice dropped to something raw, unguarded. I choose you over stability, over strategy, over every political calculation that says caring about someone makes you vulnerable. Because the alternative is continuing to exist the way I have been, feared and obeyed and completely alone. And I would rather burn this entire kingdom down than go back to that. Seraphina's breath caught, because the Duke of Blackthorne, the man who trusted nothing and no one, had just admitted he was willing to sacrifice everything for her. Had just proven that somewhere beneath all the calculated cruelty lived someone capable of devotion so absolute it bordered on madness. Had just crossed the point of no return from which there was no strategic retreat. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Storm clouds gathered above Blackthorne like the fortress was calling them home. And Seraphina understood with crystal clarity that what happened next would either forge them into something unbreakable or destroy them both completely. Because devoted predators fought without limits. And when they fell, they took entire kingdoms with them. Talk. This is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes only. The conspiracy revealed itself 3 days after the Winter Sovereign Ball in the most predictable way possible, through blood on marble and a body that should not have been there. Cassian found the corpse at dawn during his routine inspection of the eastern battlements. A young guard named Thomas Wren, barely 20, throat cut with surgical precision and left sprawled across the walkway where morning patrol would find him immediately. No attempt at concealment, no effort to hide the murder, just brutal efficiency and a message carved into the stone beside the body using the dead man's own blade. She dies next. Cassian stared at those 3 words while cold wind tore at his coat and morning sun struggled to burn through fog that clung to Blackthorne like something that had learned to survive here. He did not call for help immediately, did not summon guards or raise alarms or perform any of the expected responses. Instead, he stood perfectly still, studying the scene with the focus of someone reading a document written in a language only he understood. The cut was clean, professional, not the work of some amateur hired for coin and motivation. This was someone trained in killing who wanted Cassian to know exactly how skilled they were. The positioning was deliberate. Eastern battlements overlooked the courtyard where Seraphina walked most mornings, where she would have seen this body if she had kept her usual schedule. The message was personal. Not a threat against the duchy or the kingdom or any political entity. A threat against her specifically, against the one thing Cassian had publicly declared untouchable. He crouched beside the corpse, fingers brushing the stone where those words had been carved with enough force to crack the granite. Whoever did this wanted him afraid. Wanted him to understand that his protection meant nothing against enemies willing to kill his own guards inside his own fortress. Wanted him to see that even the Iron Duke could not prevent violence when it came from close enough. The calculation was elegant in its brutality. Cassian stood, already reaching conclusions that would have taken lesser men hours to process. This was not random. This was the opening move in something larger, and whoever orchestrated it understood him well enough to know that threatening Seraphina was the fastest way to make him irrational. Footsteps behind him. He turned to find Chancellor Lucien approaching with that expression of concerned efficiency that never quite reached his eyes, flanked by 4 guards who looked like they had been roused from sleep seconds ago. "Your Grace." Lucien's gaze dropped to the body, then to the message carved in stone. His face went carefully neutral. "When was this discovered?" "Just now." Cassian's voice was flat, empty of inflection. "No one heard anything. No one saw anything. A trained killer walked through my fortress, murdered one of my guards, and left a threat carved where anyone could find it." Lucien moved closer, studying the scene with apparent concern. "The eastern battlements have reduced patrols at night during winter, standard protocol to conserve resources when threat levels are low. Perhaps we should—" "There are no reduced patrols." Cassian's words cut through the explanation like glass through skin. "I sign off on every duty roster personally. The eastern battlements had full coverage last night, 4 guards minimum, which means 3 others should have heard Thomas die." The silence stretched uncomfortably. Lucien cleared his throat. "Perhaps they were simply out of range, Your Grace. Sound carries strangely in fog. Or perhaps someone ensured they were elsewhere when this happened." Cassian's gaze locked onto the Chancellor with the intensity of a predator recognizing prey. Someone with authority to reassign guards without raising questions. Someone who knew exactly when and where to strike for maximum impact. "Your Grace, surely you do not suggest—" "I suggest nothing, Chancellor. I am stating facts. A guard is dead. A threat has been made against Lady Vale. And the security breach required inside knowledge that very few people possess. Lucian's expression remained carefully neutral, but something flickered behind his eyes. Something that might have been calculation, or might have been fear, or might have been satisfaction barely concealed. I will launch an immediate investigation, Your Grace. Every guard will be questioned. No. Cassian turned away from the body, already moving toward the stairs that led down into the fortress proper. You will secure this scene and inform no one of what was found here. The message stays hidden. The body gets removed quietly. And you will personally ensure that Lady Vale remains in her chambers under constant guard until I say otherwise. Your Grace, hiding this incident could be seen as strategic caution. Cassian paused at the top of the stairs, not looking back. Whoever did this wants me panicked, wants me making visible security changes that broadcast fear. I will not give them that satisfaction. Now follow your orders, Chancellor, before I start wondering why you arrived here so quickly after I discovered the body. He descended into Blackthorne without waiting for response, because the Duke had just realized something that changed every calculation he had been making. The threat was not external. It was already inside the fortress, and it had been there long enough to know exactly where to cut. But Serafina woke to find guards stationed outside her door who refused to let her leave. Not impolitely, not with force or threat, just quiet insistence that His Grace had issued orders regarding her safety, and those orders did not include morning walks or court attendance or anything beyond remaining in her chambers until further notice. She dressed anyway, ate the breakfast servants delivered without explanation, tried to read but found her attention fracturing every time footsteps passed in the corridor outside. Something had happened. She could feel it in the way servants moved through the halls below her window, too quickly, too quietly, like the entire fortress had collectively decided that drawing attention was now a survival risk. Hours passed with agonizing slowness. Then the door opened without warning and Cassian entered, already closing it behind him before the guards could follow. He looked like he had not slept, like he had spent the entire night dealing with something that required the kind of focus that burned through energy reserves and left nothing but exhausted determination. What happened? Serafina set her book aside. Cassian moved to the window, hands clasped behind his back, staring out at the cliffs where storm clouds gathered with familiar inevitability. Someone killed one of my guards last night, cut his throat on the eastern battlements, and left a message saying, "You die next." The words landed like physical blows. Serafina's breath caught. Who? I do not know yet, but whoever it was knew guard rotations, knew patrol patterns, knew exactly where and when to strike for maximum impact. This was not some hired assassin from outside. This was someone with access, authority, and detailed knowledge of how Blackthorne operates. Lucian, she said immediately. Cassian's shoulders tensed. You sound certain. He warned me this would happen. Told me your enemies would use me as leverage. Explained in helpful detail exactly how vulnerable my presence makes you. And then 3 days later, someone murders a guard and threatens me specifically. That is not coincidence, Cassian. That is orchestration. He turned to face her fully. If Lucian is behind this, he has been planning it for longer than 3 days. This kind of conspiracy requires preparation, resources, coordination with houses outside Blackthorne. He would need allies powerful enough to move against me openly once the groundwork was established. Then we need to find those allies before they move. We. Cassian's expression shifted into something between amusement and exhaustion. You understand that involving yourself in this makes you even more of a target. I am already a target. Serafina stood, moving closer. The question is whether I remain a passive victim waiting for the next attempt or become an active participant in preventing it. The silence stretched between them. Then Cassian did something that surprised her. He reached out and pulled her against him, arms wrapping around her with the desperate strength of someone clinging to the only solid thing in collapsing architecture. I cannot lose you, he said quietly into her hair. I know that makes me weak. I know that gives enemies exactly the leverage they want. I know every strategic calculation says I should send you away, put distance between us, remove the vulnerability before it destroys everything I have built. But I cannot do it, Serafina. I would rather fight the entire kingdom than go back to existing the way I was before you. The admission was terrifying in its honesty. Serafina's hands fisted in his shirt. Then we fight, together, and we make sure whoever is coming for us learns exactly why threatening the Iron Duke was the last mistake they ever made. The investigation began in secret and moved with surgical precision. Cassian interrogated guards personally, one by one, in his private study where conversations could not be overheard. He reviewed duty rosters going back 6 months, searching for patterns in reassignments and schedule changes. He examined financial records looking for unusual expenditures or payments that might indicate bribery. And he found nothing. Whoever had orchestrated the murder had covered their tracks with professional thoroughness. But absence of evidence was itself evidence of planning sophisticated enough to require resources beyond what any single conspirator could provide alone, which meant multiple houses were involved, which meant the conspiracy was larger than simple assassination. On the 3rd day of investigation, a servant girl named Elena requested private audience with the Duke. She arrived trembling, barely 16, eyes red from crying. Cassian received her in his study with Serafina present because at this point, maintaining distance felt more dangerous than appearing united. "Speak," he said without preamble. Elena's voice shook. "I saw something the night Thomas died, Your Grace. I was delivering linens to the Eastern Wing, and I saw Chancellor Lucian speaking with Lord Ravencroft in the corridor near the battlements. They were arguing. The Chancellor said something about timing, and you said 3 days, and now it has been 3 days, and Thomas is dead, and I thought—" She broke into sobs before finishing. Serafina moved to her side, hand on her shoulder. "You thought we should know." Elena nodded miserably. "I am probably wrong. The Chancellor would never betray his grace. But I saw what I saw, and I could not stop thinking about it. And—" "You did the right thing," Cassian interrupted. His voice was gentle, in a way Serafina had never heard before. Coming forward took courage. "You may have saved lives. Now I need you to tell me exactly what you heard, every word you can remember." Elena recounted the conversation in halting fragments. Words about the winter ball creating opportunity. Something about southern houses being ready to move once the signal was given. Ravencroft saying the girl has to disappear before he weakens further. The pieces assembled themselves into a picture Cassian did not want to see, but could no longer deny. Lucien had been coordinating with Ravencroft, had been planning something timed to the winter ball, had been working to remove Serafina specifically, which meant the Chancellor was not just a conspirator, he was the architect. After Elena left under guard protection, Serafina turned to Cassian with grim satisfaction. "We have him." "No." Cassian's jaw was tight. "We have suspicion and testimony from a frightened servant, not evidence. Not proof that would convince the noble houses to support his arrest. If I move against Lucien without absolute certainty, the houses allied with him will claim persecution and use it as justification for open rebellion. Then we get absolute certainty." "How?" Serafina's smile was cold. "We give him exactly what he wants. We make him think he is winning. And when he moves to complete whatever he is planning, we catch him in the act with witnesses who cannot be dismissed. That requires using you as bait." "Yes." Cassian stared at her like she had suggested walking into fire voluntarily. "Absolutely not. It is the only way to expose the conspiracy completely. If Lucien believes I am vulnerable, he will take the opportunity to eliminate me. We control the circumstances, we control the witnesses, and we finally get the proof you need to act without triggering civil war. And if something goes wrong, if the trap fails, if I miscalculate and you end up dead because I was too arrogant to find another way," Serafina moved close enough to touch his face. "Then you burn down everyone responsible and make sure the kingdom remembers why. Threatening what belongs to the Iron Duke is a mistake no one survives." The statement should have sounded like bravado. Instead, it sounded like faith. They set the trap for the following night during a small council meeting. Cassian announced would address security concerns following the guard's murder. The meeting was invitation only. Chancellor Lucien, Lord Ravencroft, 3 other lords known to have Southern House sympathies, and Duke Cassian himself, with Serafina positioned in an adjacent chamber where she could hear everything but remain hidden. The room was rigged with guards concealed in passages behind the walls. Witnesses loyal to Cassian stationed where they could observe without being seen. Every word spoken would be heard by a dozen ears besides those officially present. Cassian opened the meeting with characteristic bluntness. One of my guards was murdered 3 days ago. A threat was made against Lady Vale. I have reason to believe the conspiracy extends beyond simple assassination into something larger. I want theories, I want suspects, and I want complete honesty about what any of you might know regarding houses that oppose my protection of the Vale girl. The silence was profound. Then Lucien spoke with that tone of helpful concern that had served him so well for so long. Your Grace, perhaps the threat is not about Lady Vale specifically. Perhaps it is about what she represents. Your willingness to allow personal feeling to influence duchy policy. Several houses have expressed concern that your judgment has been compromised by attachment. Compromised how? Cassian's voice was dangerously quiet. You declared her untouchable at the winter ball, Your Grace. Made her status equal to your own, bound your reputation to protecting someone whose father committed treason against the crown. Some houses see that as weakness, as evidence that the Iron Duke can be manipulated through emotional vulnerability. And you, Chancellor? Do you see it as weakness? Lucien hesitated fractionally. I see it as risk, Your Grace. Risk that enemies will exploit. Risk that requires mitigation before it destabilizes everything you have built. Mitigation how? The Chancellor glanced at Lord Ravencroft, then back to Cassian. By removing the vulnerability. Quietly. Without spectacle. An unfortunate accident, perhaps. Something that allows you to mourn privately while restoring confidence that your governance remains unclouded by sentiment. You are suggesting I have Seraphina killed. I am suggesting, Your Grace, that sacrificing one life to preserve the stability of an entire duchy is the kind of ruthless calculation you have made successfully for years. This should be no different. Behind the wall, Seraphina felt cold wash through her despite expecting exactly this. Because hearing someone advocate for your death with the calm efficiency of discussing crop rotations was different than imagining it. Cassian's response was so quiet it barely carried. And if I refuse? Then, Lucien said carefully, the houses aligned with Southern interests will be forced to act. Not against you directly, Your Grace. That would be suicide. But against the girl, against the weakness she represents, and when you inevitably retaliate to protect her, the kingdom splits. Civil war becomes inevitable. Thousands die. All because you could not make the same hard choice your father made dozens of times. My father, Cassian said softly, died choking on poison at a state dinner because he made so many enemies that someone close enough to touch him decided murder was easier than loyalty. The words dropped into silence like stones into deep water. Lucien's mask slipped for just a moment. Your Grace. You orchestrated the guard's murder. Cassian's tone remained conversational. You coordinated with Ravencroft and Southern houses to create pressure forcing me to choose between Seraphina and stability. You planned to have her killed regardless of my decision, then position yourself as the voice of reason who tried to prevent the chaos that followed. And when I inevitably burned the kingdom looking for her killers, you would step in as the Chancellor who could restore order from the ashes. The silence was absolute. Every man in the room had gone rigid. Lucien's expression shifted through calculation visible even to observers. Your Grace, these accusations are accurate. Cassian stood, movement fluid and final, and supported by testimony from witnesses you did not know were listening. Guards, you may enter now. The hidden doors opened. Armed men poured into the chamber from passages Lucien had not known existed, surrounding the conspirators with efficiency that spoke to hours of planning. Lord Ravencroft made one attempt to draw his ceremonial blade before 3 guards had him pinned face down on the table. The other lords did not even try. Lucien just stood there, watching his entire conspiracy collapse in real time, expressions cycling through shock and rage, and finally landing on something like bitter respect. You used her as bait. I used your arrogance against you, Cassian corrected. You assumed I was too compromised by emotion to think strategically. You assumed I would prioritize Seraphina's immediate safety over long-term security. You assumed wrong. The Chancellor laughed, short and sharp. You think this ends here? The houses aligned with me outnumber yours 3-1. Arrest me and you trigger exactly the civil war you are trying to prevent. Perhaps. Cassian moved to stand directly in front of him. Or perhaps those houses will see their conspiracy exposed, their leadership arrested, and decide that survival requires immediately pledging loyalty to avoid being implicated. Fear is an excellent motivator, Chancellor. You taught me that yourself. Lucien's eyes narrowed. She has made you soft, Cassian. The old Duke would have executed me the moment suspicion arose. Would not have risked elaborate traps or public trials. Would have simply eliminated the threat and moved on. You are absolutely right. Cassian's smile was cold. The old Duke would have killed you 3 days ago and probably started a war doing it. But Serafina has taught me something more valuable than ruthless efficiency. She has taught me that measured response can be more devastating than immediate violence, that letting enemies think they are winning before destroying them completely sends better messages than quick executions ever could. He gestured to the guards. Take the Chancellor and Lord Ravencroft to the dungeons. The others can wait in secured chambers while we determine their level of involvement, and summon every noble house currently in residence. We are holding a tribunal at dawn. Everyone will witness exactly what happens to men who mistake patience for weakness. The tribunal convened in the Great Hall as sunrise burned through fog. Every noble house sent representatives. Foreign ambassadors attended under guard. Ministers filled the galleries. Servants lined the walls. The crowd was so dense that breathing felt like labor. Cassian presided from his throne, while Lucien and Ravencroft knelt in chains on the floor below, still wearing the clothes they had been arrested in, faces marked by a night in cells that did not offer comfort. Serafina stood on the dais beside Cassian, despite protests from ministers who claimed her presence was inappropriate. He had insisted, made it clear that her visibility was part of the message being delivered, that the Duke of Blackthorne did not hide what he protected. The charges were read aloud. Conspiracy to commit murder. Treason against ducal authority. Coordination with foreign interests to destabilize the Northern Territories. The evidence was presented methodically. Elena's testimony, records of meetings, intercepted communications that had been found once investigators knew where to look. By the time the presentation finished, the conspiracy was laid bare for everyone to see. Cassian rose from the throne. Chancellor Lucien served me for 20 years, advised me through countless crises, helped build the systems that keep this duchy functioning. And in all that time, I never once questioned his loyalty because I believed competence and self-interest would keep him aligned with my goals. He descended the dais slowly. I was wrong, not about his competence, not about his self-interest, but about believing those were sufficient foundation for trust. Because true betrayal does not come from incompetent enemies. It comes from capable allies who decide your vision no longer serves their ambition. He stopped in front of Lucien. You wanted me to kill Serafina, to sacrifice her to maintain political stability, to prove I was still the ruthless Duke you had spent 2 decades helping cultivate. And when I refused, you decided to remove both of us, her through murder, me through civil war that would leave you positioned to rebuild on your terms. Lucien's expression was carefully neutral. I did what I believed necessary for the duchy, Your Grace. Personal loyalty must sometimes yield to greater responsibility. No! Cassian's voice cut through the hall. You did what you believed necessary for yourself. You saw my protection of Serafina as threat to your influence, saw my willingness to care about someone as weakness you could exploit, and you convinced yourself that removing that weakness was service instead of self-preservation. He turned to address the assembled crowd. Let me be absolutely clear about something. I am not the Duke my father was. He governed through terror so complete that everyone around him lived in constant fear. He trusted no one, loved nothing, and died alone because he had spent decades ensuring isolation was his only protection. I refuse to become that man. The admission rippled through the hall like electricity. Protecting Lady Vale does not make me weak, it makes me human. And human rulers are harder to manipulate than isolated tyrants because humans form bonds, build loyalty, and create connections that turn solitary power into collective strength. He gestured to the guards. Chancellor Lucien and Lord Ravencroft are hereby stripped of all titles, lands, and privileges. They will be held in custody while formal charges are prepared for Crown review. The houses that supported their conspiracy have until sunset to submit sworn statements of renewed loyalty or face seizure of assets and banishment from the Northern Territories. Lucien finally broke his careful neutrality. You are making a mistake, Cassian. Mercy will be seen as weakness. The houses will test you, and eventually someone will exploit the same vulnerability I tried to eliminate. Then they will learn the same lesson you are learning now. Cassian's smile was colder than winter. That I do not need to be cruel constantly to be capable of devastating violence when necessary. That patience is not weakness, and that threatening what I protect does not expose vulnerability. It triggers the kind of ruthless response that makes my father's legacy look gentle by comparison. Guards dragged Lucien and Ravencroft from the hall while the assembled nobility watched in silence. No one spoke. No one moved. They just stared at the Duke, who had somehow transformed from isolated tyrant into something far more unpredictable, a ruler who cared about someone and survived the vulnerability that should have destroyed him. Cassian returned to the throne. This tribunal is concluded. The lords waiting in chambers will be interviewed individually and released or charged based on evidence of their involvement. Anyone with information regarding the conspiracy is encouraged to provide it voluntarily before investigations uncover it independently. And I remind everyone present that House Draven does not forgive betrayal, but rewards loyalty with protection that is proven remarkably difficult to circumvent. He dismissed them with a gesture. The hall emptied slowly, nobles departing in clusters that whispered urgently about everything they had just witnessed. Finally, only Cassian and Seraphina remained on the dais, surrounded by guards who pretended not to listen. "You changed the rules," she said quietly. "I had to." He looked exhausted, triumphant but completely drained. "The old rules nearly got you killed and would have triggered civil war. I needed something better, something that let me be strong without being isolated, something that proved caring about you made me more dangerous instead of more vulnerable." And did it work? Ask me in 6 months when we see whether the houses submit their loyalty oaths or test the boundaries I just established. For now, I am just relieved you are alive, and Lucien is in chains, and I did not have to burn the kingdom down to prove a point. Seraphina smiled despite the exhaustion she felt. "You would have, though, burned it all, without hesitation." His hand found hers, without regret, and with absolute certainty that some things are worth more than stability, more than strategy, and more than every political calculation that says caring makes you weak. The admission hung between them. Then Cassian stood, pulling her up with him, and led her from the dais toward the private corridors that led to his chambers. Because the Duke of Blackthorne had just proven something that would reshape the northern territories for generations. That ruthless men could learn to care without losing their edge. That devotion did not equal weakness when backed by demonstrated willingness to destroy anyone who tested that equation. And that the most dangerous predators were not the ones who killed without feeling. They were the ones who learned to protect what they loved with the same brutal efficiency they used to eliminate threats. Cassian had crossed a threshold he could never uncross, had chosen Seraphina over isolation, connection over control, and survived the test that should have destroyed him. Now he just needed to live with the man that choice had transformed him into. Someone who had discovered that caring about another person did not make you weak. It made you absolutely terrifying to anyone foolish enough to threaten what you loved. But this is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes only. The loyalty oaths arrived in waves over the following week. Each one a small surrender wrapped in formal language and sealed with wax that barely concealed the fear beneath. Cassian reviewed them personally in his study while winter storms battered Blackthorne's walls and turned the cliffs into vertical rivers of ice water. House Thornfield submitted first, their oath accompanied by gifts expensive enough to communicate desperation. House Blackwood followed within hours, then House Ashford, then a dozen minor houses whose names barely registered but whose collective submission meant the conspiracy's support structure was collapsing faster than anyone had predicted. By the 5th day, only 3 houses had not responded. House Ravencroft, which was expected, given their lord was currently chained in the dungeons awaiting formal charges. House Meridian from the southern provinces, whose silence felt deliberate rather than delayed. And House Corwin, a minor but strategically positioned territory that controlled the mountain passes between northern and southern regions. Seraphina stood by the window watching ice form patterns on glass, while Cassian worked through the documents with mechanical efficiency. She had learned to read his moods through the angle of his shoulders, the tension in his jaw, the way his hands moved across paper with either confidence or barely controlled frustration. Right now he was frustrated. 3 houses, she observed quietly. Out of how many total? 47 with significant holdings in the northern territories. Cassian set another oath aside, already reaching for the next. 3 refusals out of 47 should be manageable. But these three control access points I cannot afford to lose. If they coordinate resistance, they could choke supply lines and force me into military action that would validate every warning Lucian made about my judgment being compromised. Then we make them submit before they can coordinate. We. He glanced up with that expression somewhere between exasperation and affection. You understand that you are not actually obligated to participate in duchy governance. I understand that my presence caused this crisis. Serafina turned from the window. I would prefer to help resolve it rather than hide in my chambers waiting for you to fix everything alone. The admission landed between them with more weight than she had intended. Cassian stood, moving around the desk to where she waited. Your presence did not cause this crisis. Lucien's ambition caused it. Ravencroft's opportunism caused it. The Southern houses seeing vulnerability where I showed humanity caused it. You simply existed, Serafina. That is not a crime requiring atonement. Tell that to the three houses refusing to submit. I would rather tell them what happens when they test whether my protection of you was temporary insanity or permanent policy shift. His hand settled on her waist with possessive certainty. Because I'm very interested in demonstrating that caring about you has not made me gentle. It has made me significantly more dangerous to anyone foolish enough to assume otherwise. Before she could respond, someone knocked urgently on the study door. Cassian's expression shifted immediately back to the careful neutrality he wore like armor in public. Enter. A guard pushed the door open, face pale. Your Grace, riders approaching from the south. House Meridian's banner. They are requesting immediate audience under terms of diplomatic immunity. How many riders? 50, Your Grace. Armed but displaying peace banners. 50 armed men was not a diplomatic party. It was a military escort delivering an ultimatum they expected might require enforcement. Cassian's jaw tightened fractionally. Summon the council to the Great Hall, full guard complement, and ensure Lady Vale has protection that cannot be bypassed by anyone regardless of diplomatic status. Your Grace, the guard hesitated. Should Lady Vale attend the audience? Yes. Cassian's voice was flat. Absolute. House Meridian needs to see exactly what they are threatening. Hiding her suggests I regret my choices. I regret nothing. Mosek. The great hall filled quickly with tension so thick it pressed against lungs and made breathing feel like work. Nobles arranged themselves along the walls in careful hierarchy, while guards positioned themselves at every exit with the kind of visible presence that communicated this meeting could turn violent without warning. Ministers clustered near the dais wearing expressions ranging from concern to barely concealed fear. Cassian sat on his throne dressed in formal blacks, with the Draven wolf displayed prominently, every inch the ruthless duke who had spent 15 years making the Northern Territories synonymous with brutal efficiency. No softness in his posture, no warmth in his expression, just focused intensity that made grown men check their exits and calculate survival odds. Serafina stood beside the throne where everyone could see her, wearing deep emerald silk that marked her as something between honored guest and official consort. The positioning was deliberate. Cassian was making a statement before the Southern Lords even entered the hall, that she was not hidden, not protected through obscurity, protected through his demonstrated willingness to destroy anyone who treated her as acceptable collateral. The massive doors groaned open. Lord Darius Meridian entered, flanked by 4 armored guards, all of them moving with the practiced efficiency of men accustomed to violence who knew exactly how much force they represented. Darius himself was older than Cassian by perhaps a decade, silver threading through dark hair, dressed in the deep crimson of his house, with enough military decorations to announce he had earned his position through conquest rather than inheritance. He stopped 10 feet from the dais and did not bow. The insult was deliberate and absolute. The hall went deathly silent. Cassian did not move, did not react. Just studied the Southern Lord with the detached interest of someone examining an insect and deciding whether it required elimination. Lord Meridian. His voice carried through the chamber without effort. You requested audience. I granted it. Speak your purpose before my patience expires along with your diplomatic immunity. Darius smiled without warmth. Always direct, Duke Draven. I appreciate that quality. It makes this conversation simpler. I come bearing a message from the southern provinces, a collective statement regarding recent events that have caused concern among houses whose territories border your domain. The southern provinces do not speak collectively unless coordinating against common threat. Cassian's tone remained neutral. What threat have I presented that requires 50 armed men to deliver correspondence? Not threat, Your Grace. Disappointment. Darius gestured vaguely towards Seraphina without looking at her directly. The Iron Duke was respected throughout the kingdom as a ruler who prioritized stability over sentiment, strategy over emotion, and duchy welfare over personal desire. Recent events suggest that reputation may have been overstated. Recent events being my decision to protect Lady Vale from conspirators who attempted to use her as leverage against me. Recent events being your declaration that a traitor's daughter is untouchable, that your personal attachment overrides political wisdom, that the Duke of Blackthorne has been compromised by affection for a woman whose family conspired against the crown itself. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Seraphina felt every eye in the hall shift toward her, weighing her worth against duchy stability, calculating whether her continued existence was acceptable cost for whatever Cassian brought to the table. Cassian's expression did not flicker. Lord Meridian, I will assume your journey has left you exhausted and prone to statements you would normally reconsider. So I will give you one opportunity to rephrase your message in language that does not constitute direct insult requiring immediate response. Darius's smile sharpened. No rephrase necessary, Your Grace. The southern provinces have discussed the situation extensively. We acknowledge your authority within the northern territories. We respect the power you wield. But we cannot ignore that your judgment has become clouded by inappropriate attachment to a girl whose mere existence destabilizes regional politics. Therefore, the southern provinces present the following terms. You will remove Lady Vale from Blackthorne Keep. You will revoke your protection and allow natural consequences to proceed. You will demonstrate that the Iron Duke remains capable of ruthless decision-making unclouded by sentiment. And if I refuse? Cassian's voice was dangerously quiet. Then the southern provinces will be forced to conclude that the northern territories require new leadership, leadership capable of prioritizing kingdom stability over personal desire. We have no wish for conflict, Your Grace, but we will not allow one man's weakness to threaten the entire region's security. The threat landed like a declaration of war wrapped in diplomatic courtesy, because that was exactly what it was. The southern houses were not requesting compliance. They were demanding Cassian choose between Seraphina and his position, between protecting what he cared about and maintaining the power that made that protection possible. They were forcing him into the exact corner Lucian had tried to create, and they were doing it publicly, with witnesses, in a way that made any response a statement that would echo through the kingdom for years. Cassian stood slowly. The movement was fluid and economical and somehow transformed the entire dynamic in the chamber. He descended the dais steps with deliberate precision, each footfall echoing against marble until he stood directly in front of Lord Meridian, close enough that guards tensed, close enough that the Southern Lord's confidence flickered visibly. Let me ensure I understand your message correctly, Cassian said softly. The southern provinces have decided that my protection of Lady Vale constitutes unacceptable weakness, that caring about someone makes me unfit to govern, that demonstrating humanity disqualifies me from leadership. That is the substance of it, yes. And you traveled here with 50 armed men to deliver this ultimatum because you believed the threat of southern military coordination would convince me to sacrifice the woman I have publicly declared untouchable. We believed you would see reason, Your Grace, would recognize that some prices are too high for personal satisfaction. Cassian smiled. It was not a pleasant expression, not warm or reassuring or anything remotely human. It was the smile of something predatory recognizing prey that had just made a fatal miscalculation. Lord Meridian, I'm going to explain something very carefully. When I declared Seraphina untouchable, I was not making a request for approval. I was not opening negotiations. I was stating reality. She is under my protection. That protection is absolute. And any attempt to circumvent it constitutes declaration of war against House Draven and everything we represent. He paused. You seem to believe that caring about her makes me weak, that affection clouds my judgment, that love is vulnerability waiting to be exploited. You are catastrophically wrong. Caring about Seraphina has not made me gentle, Lord Meridian. It has shown me exactly how far I am willing to go when something I value is threatened. And that distance is significantly further than anything my father ever contemplated. The hall was silent enough to hear hearts beating, So here are my terms, Cassian continued quietly. You will return to the southern provinces. You will inform every house that participated in this ultimatum that their window for peaceful submission has closed. Any house that does not swear loyalty to House Draven within 3 days will be considered an active rebellion. Territories will be seized, assets frozen, leadership arrested for conspiracy against ducal authority. You cannot enforce that, Darius said, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. The southern provinces outnumber your forces significantly. Military action would devastate both regions. You're absolutely correct. Cassian's smile widened fractionally. Which is why I will not be using military forces. I will be using economics, trade routes through mountain passes you do not control, resource allocation from suppliers who prefer my gold to your threats, financial pressure that will strangle your territories slowly while I wait for desperation to do what diplomacy could not. That is not war, Your Grace. That is siege. Yes. And I am exceptionally good at sieges. Ask the families of the 17 men my father hanged for questioning a tax increase. Ask the noble houses that tested my authority when I first inherited and learned that youth does not equal mercy. Ask anyone in the northern territories whether the Duke of Blackthorne makes empty threats. He leaned closer. Or better yet, test me yourself. Refuse submission, coordinate your rebellion, mass your forces and prepare for conflict. And when your territories are starving, your nobles are bankrupted, and your people are rioting in streets because I have systematically dismantled every economic foundation you rely on. Remember that I gave you the opportunity to bow peacefully. Darius stared at him with the dawning realization that he had miscalculated badly, because the Duke was not weakened by caring about Seraphina. He was radicalized by it. You would destroy the entire region over one woman? Without hesitation. Cassian's voice was flat. Absolute, without regret, and with complete certainty that she is worth more than every political calculation that says otherwise. Now get out of my fortress before I decide that diplomatic immunity is a courtesy I no longer feel obligated to honor. Darius retreated toward the doors, flanked by guards who moved with considerably more urgency than they had entering. The Southern Lord paused at the threshold, turning back with something between respect and fear. You have changed, Duke Draven. Yes, Cassian agreed. I have learned that being feared is useful, but being underestimated is fatal. You came here expecting the old Duke, the one who would sacrifice anything for strategic advantage. But that man died the moment I decided Seraphina was worth keeping. What replaced him is significantly more dangerous. I suggest you inform the southern provinces accordingly. The doors closed behind them with thunderous finality. The hall remained silent for a long moment. Then Cassian turned to face his assembled court with an expression that dared anyone to question what had just transpired. The southern provinces have 3 days to submit loyalty oaths. Any house that refuses will face immediate economic sanctions and political isolation. Prepare contingencies for military response if diplomacy fails, and make absolutely certain that every noble in this kingdom understands that threatening Lady Vale is not strategy, it is suicide. He returned to the throne. The meeting dissolved slowly, nobles departing in clusters that whispered urgently about everything they had witnessed. Seraphina remained standing beside the throne, heart pounding, trying to process the fact that Cassian had just declared economic war on half the kingdom rather than compromise on her safety, had just proven that his protection was not performance or political maneuvering. It was absolute commitment backed by demonstrated willingness to burn everything down rather than yield. When the hall finally emptied, Cassian reached for her hand without looking away from the doors where Lord Meridian had departed. 3 days, he said quietly. Either they submit or we go to war. Either they recognize that I meant what I said, or I spend the next year destroying every house that tested whether my devotion made me vulnerable. And if we lose, if the economic pressure fails and they call your bluff, then we do not lose. His grip on her hand tightened. Because I was not bluffing, Seraphina. I will starve their territories. I will bankrupt their houses. I will systematically dismantle every structure they rely on until submission is their only survival option. And if that makes me a tyrant, if that proves I have become exactly the kind of ruthless bastard my father was, so be it. You are worth that price. The admission should have terrified her. Instead, it felt like safety, because devoted predators fought without limits. And Cassian had just proven he had no limits when it came to protecting what he loved. The first day passed without response. The second day brought scattered submissions from minor houses who recognized that opposing the Duke of Blackthorne when he had entered this particular state of focused fury was essentially volunteering for destruction. The third day arrived with storms that turned the world outside Blackthorne into howling chaos, while inside, the fortress prepared for the conflict everyone knew was coming. Cassian spent the morning reviewing military inventories and economic projections with ministers who looked increasingly concerned about the scale of resources being committed to what was essentially a war over one woman's continued existence. Serafina watched from the corner of his study, officially present as his personal guest, but functionally operating as advisor whose insights he valued enough to request openly. "The mountain passes through House Corwin's territory," she said during a lull in the strategic discussion. "If we control those, the southern provinces lose their primary trade route to the eastern kingdoms. Everything else they can work around eventually, but cutting that access point would be devastating within weeks." Cassian looked up from the map he had been studying. "Corwin has not submitted loyalty oaths. Taking military action against them would trigger exactly the armed conflict I am trying to avoid. Not military action. Economic incentive." She moved to the table, pointing to the pass locations marked on the map. "Offer House Corwin exclusive trade agreements and tariff exemptions if they close their passes to southern province traffic. Make it more profitable for them to ally with you than remain neutral. You said yourself that gold works better than threats when dealing with opportunistic houses." The room went quiet. Ministers exchanged glances that communicated exactly how uncomfortable they were with the Duke's consort openly participating in strategy sessions that would determine the kingdom's immediate future. Cassian stared at the map with focus that meant he was running calculations too complex to articulate immediately. Then he smiled. "That is brilliant." He looked up at her with something between admiration and hunger. House Corwin has remained neutral because neither side offered them better terms than waiting. But exclusive trade rights through passes they already control would represent immediate profit without requiring them to commit forces to actual combat. Minister Aldrich, the oldest advisor present, cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Your Grace, while Lady Vale's suggestion has strategic merit, perhaps it would be more appropriate if..." "If what, Minister?" Cassian's tone went dangerously quiet. "If I dismissed her so men more comfortable with traditional hierarchy could continue offering conventional wisdom that has already failed to prevent this crisis." "Your Grace, I merely meant..." "I know exactly what you meant. And I am telling you that Serafina stays. She has proven more valuable in 3 minutes of strategic analysis than some of you have provided in 3 hours of reciting doctrine from military manuals written by men who never actually fought wars." He turned back to the map. "Draft terms for House Corwin immediately. Exclusive trade agreements, tariff exemptions, and a seat on the Northern Council if they close their passes to southern traffic within 48 hours. Make it generous enough that refusing would be financially suicidal." The ministers scrambled to execute the order while Serafina stood beside the table feeling the weight of every eye that tracked her movements, calculated her influence, and wondered exactly how much power the Duke's untouchable consort actually wielded. The answer, she was learning, was exactly as much as Cassian chose to grant her, and he was choosing to grant significant amounts. Chad. House Corwin submitted their loyalty oath 6 hours later. The messenger arrived during dinner, soaking wet from riding through storms, bearing documents sealed with wax that still felt warm from hasty preparation. Cassian read the oath in silence while the entire hall watched, nobles frozen mid-conversation, servants paused mid-service, everyone waiting to see whether the strategic gambit had worked or whether they were about to witness the Duke's careful economic pressure collapse into actual warfare. He set the document down slowly. "House Corwin has agreed to terms. Their mountain passes close to southern province traffic at dawn tomorrow. Any merchant attempting to use those routes will be turned back under authority of House Draven." The relief in the hall was palpable, because cutting the passes meant the southern provinces lost their primary economic artery, meant their ability to sustain resistance collapsed from months to weeks, meant that Cassian's threat of systematic economic dismantlement had just become immediate reality instead of distant possibility. One of the ministers leaned toward another and whispered something that included the phrase "remarkable strategy." Cassian heard it anyway. His hearing had always been unnaturally sharp. He glanced toward Serafina with an expression that communicated exactly whose strategy deserved credit, while simultaneously making clear he would not publicly acknowledge it in ways that might diminish her safety through visibility. The remaining 2 days passed in mounting tension. House Meridian submitted on the 4th day, their oath accompanied by formal apology for Lord Darius's inappropriate language during his audience. The apology was hollow, and everyone knew it, but submission was submission regardless of sincerity. House Ravencroft, lacking leadership due to their lord's imprisonment, had its assets seized and territories redistributed to houses that had demonstrated loyalty quickly enough to deserve reward. By the end of the week, every major house in the Northern Territories had sworn allegiance to House Draven with language that specifically acknowledged Duke Cassian's authority to determine his personal relationships without external interference. The crisis was over. The kingdom had bent rather than break, and Cassian had proven that a ruthless man could learn to care about someone without losing the capacity for devastating violence when that caring was threatened. Serafina stood in his private chambers that night, watching him work through final documentation, signing orders and reviewing proposals with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had spent 15 years governing through sheer force of competent brutality. "You won," she observed quietly. "We survived," he corrected without looking up. "Winning implies completion. This was just proving I meant what I said at the winter ball. The real test comes later when ambitious nobles inevitably test whether my protection of you remains absolute or becomes negotiable over time. And will it remain absolute?" Cassian set his pen down, finally giving her his full attention. "I declared you untouchable before my entire court, threatened economic war to prevent your removal, demonstrated willingness to starve territories and bankrupt houses rather than compromise on your safety. Do you actually doubt my answer? I doubt whether any person is worth that much destruction. You are." His voice was flat, certain. "And I will spend however long necessary proving it until you believe me." He stood, crossing to where she waited by the windows that overlooked cliffs, where storms had finally broken and stars were visible for the first time in days. His hands framed her face with that careful precision she had come to recognize as his version of gentleness, controlled force that could destroy but chose protection instead. "I spent 15 years believing that caring about anyone was weakness waiting to be exploited. That affection made you vulnerable. That love was just leverage enemies would use to destroy you. And then you walked into my court in chains and refused to bow and looked at me like I was human instead of weapon. And everything I thought I knew about survival stopped making sense." He paused. "You changed me, Serafina. Not into someone soft or weak or easily manipulated, into someone who finally understands that being feared is useful, but being alone is its own kind of death. That power without purpose is just cruelty. That the most dangerous version of myself is not the isolated tyrant everyone expected me to become. It is the devoted predator who has finally found something worth protecting at any cost." His forehead rested against hers. "So yes, you are worth the destruction, worth the economic war, worth every threat I made and every house I would have bankrupted. Because the alternative is returning to the empty existence I had before you, and I would rather burn the kingdom down than go back to that." Serafina's hands fisted in his shirt. "You terrify me sometimes." "Good." His smile was sharp. "You should be terrified. What I feel for you is not gentle or safe or any of the things romantic poetry claims love should be. It is possessive and absolute and borders on obsession. But it is also the most honest thing I have ever felt in my life. Then kiss me before someone interrupts with another crisis requiring immediate attention." He did. And somewhere in Blackthorne's eastern towers, bells began ringing urgent alarm. The sound cut through their moment like blade through silk. Cassian pulled back immediately, already moving toward the door with the instant transition from intimate to tactical that came from 15 years of governance, where crises arrived without warning or consideration for personal moments. "Stay here," he ordered. "Lock the door. Do not open it for anyone except me or guards I send personally." "What is happening?" "I do not know yet. But those bells mean breach. Someone got through the gates or over the walls or found entrance we did not secure. And given that every house just swore loyalty under economic duress, the timing feels less like coincidence and more like someone deciding submission was temporary strategy rather than permanent surrender." He was already out the door, shouting orders that echoed through corridors as guards mobilized with practiced efficiency. Serafina stood alone in chambers that suddenly felt more like cage than sanctuary, listening to alarm bells ring and boots thunder past and voices shout coordinations that meant Blackthorne Keep was under attack despite every precaution Cassian had implemented. And she understood with cold certainty that the crisis was not over. It had merely evolved into something that required blood instead of economics to resolve. Because devoted predators were dangerous when defending what they loved. But cornered predators were absolutely lethal. And somewhere in the fortress below, someone had just cornered the Duke of Blackthorne on his own territory while threatening the one thing he had proven he would burn kingdoms to protect. The bells continued ringing. Steel clashed against steel in distant corridors. And Serafina realized that whatever came next would either forge them into legend or destroy them both in flames that would consume far more than just Blackthorne Keep. This is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes only. The breach came from within. Cassian understood this within seconds of reaching the eastern corridor where guards fought against men wearing Blackthorne uniforms who should not have been fighting at all. Steel rang against steel in confined space where strategy mattered less than raw violence and the willingness to kill people you had eaten breakfast beside that morning. Traitors among his own garrison. Not hired assassins from outside, not Southern Province infiltrators. His own men, turned against him through promises or threats or whatever currency bought loyalty from those who had sworn oaths and worn his colors and stood watch over walls they were now helping enemies breach. The realization hit harder than any blade could have, because Cassian had spent 15 years building Blackthorne into a fortress where loyalty was absolute and betrayal was impossible, had implemented systems and protocols and ruthless consequences designed specifically to prevent exactly this scenario, had believed that fear and competence were sufficient foundation for trust. He had been catastrophically wrong. A guard lunged at him from the left, Thomas's brother, a man named Marcus, who had served House Draven for 8 years without incident, and Cassian barely deflected the blade in time. No hesitation in Marcus's eyes. No regret. Just focused determination to kill the Duke who had failed to prevent his sibling's murder and was now being held accountable through violence. Cassian's response was instinctive and brutal. He drove his blade through Marcus's guard, felt steel punch through leather and flesh, watched comprehension and then nothing flicker across features that went slack as life departed. The body fell. Cassian kept moving. Because grief was a luxury afforded to men who survived, and right now survival required reaching Serafina before whoever orchestrated this reached her first. The corridor opened into the grand staircase where more fighting spilled across marble steps slick with blood. Loyalist guards battled traitors who outnumbered them significantly, suggesting this conspiracy had been growing quietly for weeks, while Cassian focused on external threats and missed the rot spreading inside his own fortress. He took the stairs 3 at a time, blade in hand, shouting orders to guards who could hear him over the chaos. Secure the southern tower. Lock down all entrances to the private chambers. Get every loyal man to... Explosion. The eastern wall detonated inward with force that turned stone into shrapnel and threw Cassian sideways into the railing. His ears rang, vision blurred. Taste of copper flooded his mouth where he had bitten his tongue on impact. Through the smoke and dust, figures moved with military precision. Not Blackthorne guards. Not nobles playing at rebellion. Actual soldiers wearing colors he recognized from intelligence reports about Southern Province mercenary companies. House Meridian had not submitted. They had stalled for time while positioning forces to strike when Blackthorne was divided by internal betrayal. The economic war Cassian had threatened was now actual warfare, and it was happening inside his fortress while the woman he had sworn to protect sat in chambers that suddenly felt impossibly far away. He forced himself upright despite ribs that screamed protest. Blood ran down his face from a cut above his eye that he did not remember receiving. His left arm hung wrong, possibly dislocated, definitely compromised. None of it mattered, because devoted predators did not stop when injured. They fought harder, meaner. With the desperate efficiency of something that understood survival was secondary to protecting what they loved. Cassian moved through smoke and chaos, killing anyone who blocked his path, no longer distinguishing between traitor guards and mercenary soldiers, because at this point, they were all obstacles between him and Serafina, and obstacles required elimination. A mercenary came at him from the right. Cassian ducked under the blade, drove his shoulder into the man's chest, felt bones crack, and continued forward without checking whether the body stayed down. Another from the left. This one smarter, more cautious, recognizing that the Duke of Blackthorne fought with the efficiency of someone who had spent 15 years learning exactly how to kill efficiently. They exchanged blows. 3, 4, 5 strikes that would have been beautiful in any other context, but here were just violence stripped to its brutal core. Cassian's blade found the gap between armor plates. The mercenary collapsed. He kept moving. Stairs. Corridors. Doorways that seemed endless despite knowing this fortress like he knew his own reflection. Each step cost energy he did not have. Each breath burned in lungs that had inhaled too much smoke. Each heartbeat hammered reminder that men his age did not win fights through endurance. They won through being more willing to die than their opponents. Finally, the corridor that led to his private chambers. Guards lay dead outside the door. Loyalists, based on their positioning, killed trying to prevent exactly what Cassian now faced. The door stood open. He entered ready for ambush, blade raised, prepared for violence. What he found was worse. Serafina sat in a chair by the window, wrists bound with cord that had drawn blood from her struggles. Standing behind her with a blade pressed against her throat was Lord Darius Meridian himself, still wearing the crimson that announced his house allegiance, face marked by smoke and minor cuts that suggested he had fought his way here personally. 3 mercenaries flanked him, crossbows aimed at the doorway where Cassian had frozen mid-entrance. "Drop your weapon, Duke Draven," Darius said calmly, "or I open her throat and you watch her bleed out on this expensive carpet while contemplating the strategic miscalculations that led here." Cassian did not drop his blade, did not move, just stood perfectly still while his mind raced through tactical options that all ended with Serafina dead, or him dead, or everyone dead, depending on variables he could not control. "The southern provinces submitted their oaths," he said quietly. "You swore loyalty, agreed to terms. We lied." Darius's smile was sharp. "Shocking, I know. But it turns out that men facing economic destruction become creative about survival strategies. We submitted oaths to buy time for proper military response. Used your focus on loyalty ceremonies to position forces and turn your own guards through promises that serving House Meridian would be more profitable than dying for the Duke who let their brothers get murdered." "Marcus." Cassian's voice was flat. "You turned him." Among others. Darius pressed the blade fractionally harder against Serafina's throat. Grief makes men susceptible to persuasion. Loss makes them angry. And angry men will betray anything if you promise them the vengeance their duke failed to provide. The accusation landed because it was accurate. Cassian had failed to prevent Thomas's death, had been so focused on external conspiracy that he missed the pain spreading through his own garrison. Had assumed fear and competence were sufficient when what men actually needed was the belief that their duke gave a damn whether they lived or died beyond their utility as soldiers. He had governed like his father, and his father had died choking on poison administered by someone close enough to touch him. The pattern was repeating with precision that would have been poetic if it were not so devastating. "I will give you one opportunity," Darius continued. "Stand down. Order your remaining guards to surrender. Allow the southern provinces to assume governance of the northern territories through transitional leadership that does not include yourself. Do this, and Lady Vale lives. She will be escorted safely to neutral territory and released without harm." Cassian's laugh was bitter. "You expect me to believe you would honor that agreement after demonstrating that oaths mean nothing when survival requires betrayal?" "No," Darius admitted, "but I expect you to make the choice anyway because the alternative is watching her die. You have spent weeks proving that she matters more to you than power, more than strategy, more than every ruthless calculation that built your reputation. Now prove it means more than your life." The silence stretched. Serafina's eyes met Cassian's across the space between them. She was terrified. He could see that in the tension around her jaw, the rapid pulse visible at her throat, the way her hands had clenched despite the bindings cutting into her wrists. But she was not begging, was not weeping or pleading or performing any of the expected theater. She was watching him with the same steady focus she had shown when entering Blackthorne in chains months ago, waiting to see what he would choose when every option was devastation. Cassian understood in that moment what real power actually meant. It was not the capacity to destroy enemies or force submission or maintain order through brutality. Those were tools, means to ends, the hollow mechanisms his father had mistaken for strength. Real power was standing in front of the person you loved, while someone held a blade to their throat and choosing their survival over everything you had spent your life building. Was recognizing that devotion meant sacrifice, even when sacrifice felt like dying. Was learning that being strong enough to care about someone required being strong enough to let them go if keeping them meant watching them suffer. He lowered his blade. "Your Grace, no." Seraphina's voice broke through her control for the first time. "Do not do this. Do not give him what he wants. I am not worth—" "You are worth everything," Cassian interrupted quietly. "You are worth the duchy, the fortress, the reputation, and every ruthless decision I have made in 15 years of governance. You are worth more than power, Seraphina. You always were. I just needed to nearly lose you to understand that." He let the blade fall from his hand. Steel clattered against marble with finality that echoed through chambers built to project strength, now witnessing its surrender. "I stand down," he said to Darius. "Order my guards to withdraw. Surrender governance of the northern territories. Whatever terms you demand, I accept. Just let her live." Darius studied him with expression somewhere between satisfaction and genuine surprise. The Iron Duke begging. "I confess, I did not expect this level of capitulation. Most men would choose death over humiliation. Most men have not learned what I learned." Cassian's voice was steady, despite exhaustion and blood loss and the crushing weight of defeat. "That being feared is meaningless if you die alone and forgotten. That power without purpose is just cruelty. That the strongest version of myself is not the isolated tyrant. It is the man willing to sacrifice everything for someone who taught him how to be human again." "How touching," Darius gestured to one of the mercenaries. "Bind him. We will transport both of them to—" The crossbow bolt took the mercenary through the throat. He fell without sound, just sudden collapse and blood spreading across expensive carpet. Chaos erupted. More bolts flew through the window behind Darius as archers, Cassian had not known were positioned there, opened fire with precision that spoke to careful coordination. One caught the second mercenary in the chest. Another shattered against stone inches from the third mercenary's head, forcing him to dive for cover. Darius spun toward the window, blade still at Seraphina's throat, but his attention divided between multiple threats simultaneously. That division cost him. Seraphina drove her head backward into his face with force born of desperation. Cartilage crunched. Darius staggered. His grip on the blade wavered for just a moment. Cassian moved, not toward his fallen weapon, toward Seraphina, toward the only thing that mattered in a room full of violence and betrayal and strategic calculations that had all collapsed into simple animal need to protect. He hit Darius with his full weight, driving the Southern Lord away from Seraphina and into the wall hard enough that breath exploded from both of them on impact. No finesse, no technique, just raw collision and the desperate strength of something that had stopped caring about survival beyond ensuring the person he loved made it through this alive. They fell together in a tangle of limbs and steel. The blade, Darius's blade, dropped during the collision, skittered across marble, toward where the third mercenary was scrambling to reload his crossbow. Cassian saw it happening in fragments, the mercenary grabbing the blade, turning toward where Seraphina struggled with her bindings, still vulnerable, still exposed, saw the trajectory, the intent, the moment about to happen that would destroy everything. He threw himself toward her without thinking, without calculating cost or survival odds or strategic value. Just instinct and devotion and the absolute certainty that her life mattered more than his. The blade punched through his back between ribs that were supposed to protect vital organs, but failed because steel did not care about biology when wielded with sufficient force. Pain exploded white-hot and all-consuming. Cassian felt his legs give out, felt himself falling, felt warmth spreading across his back that meant blood loss significant enough to be very bad, very quickly. He hit the floor hard. Distantly, he heard more crossbow bolts, heard the mercenary scream, heard Darius shouting orders that cut off mid-sentence as something heavy, probably a guard finally breaching the room, crashed into him. But mostly, he heard Serafina. She was screaming his name while tearing at her bindings with strength born of panic. Finally freed, she dropped beside him, hands hovering over the wound in his back, like she wanted to help but did not know how. "Cassian, stay with me." Her voice was shaking. "You do not get to die. You do not get to sacrifice yourself and leave me here alone. That is not how this ends." He tried to respond, managed something between a laugh and a cough that brought blood to his lips. Dramatic timing. His words were slurred. "Should have let me practice this speech. Stop talking. Save your strength." She was crying now, tears cutting tracks through smoke-stained cheeks. "Guards are coming. Healers are coming. You just need to hold on." Cassian's vision was narrowing, edges going dark, but he could still see her face, could still feel her hands on his, warm and real, and the only thing anchoring him to consciousness that wanted desperately to slip away into something quieter. "Worth it," he managed. "You were worth everything." Then his vision went black. Consciousness returned in fragments, pain first, sharp and absolute, centered in his back, but radiating outward until his entire body felt like it had been reconstructed from broken pieces that did not quite fit together anymore. Then sound. Voices speaking in low tones, footsteps on stone, the crackle of fire in a hearth. Then light. Dim and orange, filtered through eyelids that felt impossibly heavy. Finally, awareness that he was lying in a bed that felt familiar, that smelled like his chambers. That meant somehow, impossibly, he had survived long enough to be transported here instead of dying on that blood-soaked carpet. He forced his eyes open. Serafina sat beside the bed in a chair pulled close enough that she could hold his hand, which she was currently doing while staring at his face with the focused intensity of someone who had been watching for signs of consciousness with desperate attention. Their eyes met. Her expression crumbled immediately. She pressed his hand against her face, shoulders shaking with sobs she had clearly been suppressing for however long he had been unconscious. "You are awake." Her voice was wrecked. Raw. "You are actually awake. The healer said you might not, that the blade had damaged, that infection could—" "How long?" Cassian's voice was barely functional. Throat felt like he had swallowed glass. 3 days. She set his hand down carefully, reaching for water that she helped him drink in slow sips. 3 days of fever and delirium, and moments where I thought you were going to die, despite everything the healers tried. Darius? Dead. One of your archers put a bolt through his eye during the chaos. The remaining mercenaries were captured or killed. House Meridian is being dismantled as we speak. Territories seized, leadership arrested, assets frozen. The conspiracy collapsed once word spread that you nearly died protecting me. She paused. The guards who betrayed you were given choice between execution or exile with nothing but what they could carry. Most chose exile. A few chose execution rather than live with the shame of having turned traitor. Marcus's family was compensated for his loss and given lands in the southern territories as reparation for your failure to protect Thomas. Good. Cassian tried to sit up, failed immediately as pain tore through his back. That is appropriate response. Stop moving. Serafina pressed him back down with surprising strength. The blade damaged muscle and came within inches of your spine. The healer said you will recover, but only if you actually rest instead of trying to govern from a bed. You should not be leaving for weeks. Cannot rest. The duchy is being managed by ministers who are terrified of disappointing you and a woman who spent 3 days making decisions in your name because someone had to keep Blackthorne functioning while you were unconscious. Serafina's expression was fierce. So, yes, I governed. I made choices. I issued orders. I did everything you would have done because the alternative was watching everything you built collapse while you fought to survive. The admission landed with weight Cassian could not immediately process. Because Serafina had not just survived the assault, she had stepped into the power vacuum his injury created and held the duchy together through sheer force of will and whatever authority people were willing to grant the woman the Duke had nearly died protecting. You governed, he repeated slowly. The duchy accepted your authority. They did not have much choice. Your formal declaration at the Winter Ball made me your recognized consort in everything but official ceremony. When you fell, That authority transferred automatically. Some ministers objected initially until I reminded them that questioning my legitimacy meant questioning your judgment, and given that you had just taken a blade meant for me, perhaps they should reconsider their priorities. Her smile was sharp. They reconsidered quickly. Cassian stared at her with something between awe and exhaustion. You managed Blackthorne during a crisis, made strategic decisions, held the duchy together while I was incapacitated. I did what was necessary, just like you taught me. No. His hand found hers again, grip weak but determined. What I taught you was ruthlessness and fear. You did something better. You led through competence and the demonstrated willingness to make hard choices. That is not my teaching, Serafina. That is who you are. The words hung between them. Then Serafina leaned forward carefully, mindful of his injuries, and kissed him with the gentleness of someone handling something precious that had nearly been lost. You are not allowed to sacrifice yourself again, she whispered against his lips. You're not allowed to throw yourself in front of blades or make dramatic speeches about how I matter more than your life. We survive together or not at all. Do you understand? Cassian's laugh hurt his ribs. That is not how devotion works. Then we rewrite the rules. Her expression was fierce. Because I refuse to lose you after everything we survived to get here. I refuse to rule alone. I refuse to become the isolated tyrant you were before I arrived. So you will recover, and you will learn to share power instead of hoarding it, and you will accept that protecting me does not require dying for me. And if I cannot accept that, then I will govern this duchy myself and make you so irrelevant through sheer competence that you have no choice but to participate or watch everything you built function better without you. The threat should not have been attractive. Somehow, it was. Because Serafina was not threatening to leave or retreat or hide behind his protection. She was threatening to become so powerful that he would have to meet her as equal or be left behind. And equals, Cassian was learning, were far more interesting than subjects. Recovery took weeks. Cassian spent them in chambers that became both prison and sanctuary, forced to govern through delegation and trust in ways that made him deeply uncomfortable, but proved surprisingly effective. Ministers reported directly to both him and Serafina, creating a dual authority structure that the duchy adapted to faster than anyone expected. Decisions that would have required his personal review were now handled collaboratively, with Serafina providing perspectives he would not have considered and occasionally overruling his suggestions when her strategic analysis proved superior. It should have felt like losing control. Instead, it felt like finally having someone trustworthy enough to share the crushing weight of governance that had defined his entire adult life. House Meridian's territories were redistributed to houses that had demonstrated loyalty during the crisis. Trade agreements were renegotiated with terms that favored northern interests while providing sufficient profit to southern provinces that rebellion no longer seemed economically rational. The mountain passes through House Corwin's lands remained closed to military traffic but open to commercial trade under strict oversight. The kingdom stabilized, not through fear or threats or brutal suppression of dissent, through strategic incentives that made cooperation more profitable than conflict and demonstrated consequences severe enough that testing boundaries became obviously stupid. 6 weeks after taking the blade, Cassian was finally cleared by healers to leave his chambers for something other than brief walks under supervision. He descended to the Great Hall during a routine council session, entering without announcement, and watched the assembled ministers scramble to their feet with expressions ranging from relief to thinly veiled panic. Serafina sat at the head of the table in a chair that was technically his, but that she had clearly been using during his absence. She did not move, did not yield the position, just looked at him with raised eyebrow that communicated exactly how much authority she had claimed during his recovery and how little interest she had in surrendering it. "Your Grace," Minister Aldrich stammered, "we did not expect you today. Lady Vale has been managing affairs admirably in your absence. But of course, now that you have recovered—" "Now that I have recovered," Cassian interrupted, moving to stand beside Serafina's chair rather than displacing her from it, "I expect affairs to continue exactly as they have been. Lady Serafina has proven herself more than capable of governance. She will retain full authority as co-regent of the Northern Territories with decision-making power equal to my own." The silence was profound. "Your Grace," another minister ventured carefully, "are you certain? Joint governance is highly irregular. There are protocols, traditions, legal precedents that—" There are no precedents for what we are building here. Cassian's voice was firm. Lady Seraphina is not a placeholder awaiting my recovery. She is my partner in governance, my equal in authority, and anyone who questions her decisions questions mine. Am I clear? Crystal clear, Your Grace. Good. Then I suggest we proceed with today's agenda. I am told there are trade disputes requiring resolution and infrastructure projects awaiting approval. Let us address them efficiently so I can return to recovering without worrying that incompetence will undo everything we have accomplished. The meeting continued with Cassian and Seraphina managing discussions collaboratively, their dynamic already established through weeks of necessity now formalized through public declaration. Later, alone in his study while evening sun painted the cliffs orange and gold, Seraphina found him staring out at the kingdom he had nearly lost and the fortress he had nearly died defending. Regretting your dramatic announcement? She asked, moving to stand beside him. No. His hand found hers automatically, regretting that it took nearly dying to realize that sharing power does not mean losing it, that having someone capable beside me is strength, not weakness, that everything my father taught me about isolation being protection was wrong. He turned to face her fully. You saved me, Seraphina. Not just during the assault. You saved me from becoming the kind of ruler who dies alone and unmourned because he spent his life ensuring no one could get close enough to hurt him. You taught me that vulnerability is not the same as weakness, that caring about someone does not make you controllable. It makes you human. And human rulers who share power with capable partners are far more dangerous than isolated tyrants ever could be. Because we have something to lose, she finished quietly. Something worth protecting. Something that makes us fight harder instead of simply calculating acceptable casualties. Exactly. The silence between them was comfortable, settled, the kind that came from two people who had survived enough chaos together that stillness felt earned rather than fragile. So what happens now? Seraphina asked. We govern jointly, rebuild what the conspiracy damaged, prove that the Northern Territories can function under leadership that values competence over cruelty. And we do it together because the alternative is returning to the isolated existence I had before you. And I have learned that particular lesson thoroughly enough not to repeat it. He pulled her closer. We also formalize what has already become obvious to everyone. I want to marry you, Seraphina, not for political advantage, not to legitimize your authority, not for any strategic reason beyond the fact that I love you and have proven through blood and near death that you matter more to me than power, reputation, or every ruthless calculation that says caring makes you weak. The proposal was characteristically blunt. No pretty speeches, no romantic gestures, just honest declaration of intent from a man who had learned that sincerity mattered more than performance. Seraphina's smile was radiant despite the tears gathering in her eyes. Yes, obviously yes, though I reserve the right to overrule your terrible governance decisions and remind you when your ruthless instincts need tempering with actual human consideration. I would expect nothing less. Good. Because I did not survive conspiracies and assassination attempts, and 3 days of watching you nearly die just to become a decorative consort who smiles and stays silent. I am keeping my authority, my voice, and my demonstrated capacity to govern this duchy as effectively as you do. You will make a terrifying duchess. That is the idea. He kissed her then, surrounded by maps of territories they would govern together and documents representing decisions they would make collaboratively, and the understanding that devotion did not require sacrifice. It required partnership, required recognizing that strength came from having someone capable beside you, rather than forcing everyone into positions below you. Required learning that the most powerful version of himself was not the isolated tyrant his father had tried to create. It was the man who learned to share power with someone he loved and trusted enough to build something better than fear-based governance could ever achieve. The wedding took place 3 months later when winter had finally released its grip on Blackthorne and spring was transforming the cliffs into something less hostile. Every major house in the Northern Territories attended. Southern provinces sent representatives bearing gifts expensive enough to communicate that bridges were being rebuilt. Foreign ambassadors filled the galleries watching the ceremony that formalized what everyone already knew, that the Duchess of Blackthorne was not decorative addition, but actual power equal to the Duke himself. Cassian stood at the altar in formal blacks, watching Serafina approach through crowds that parted before her with respect that had been earned through demonstrated competence rather than granted through his protection. She wore silver and emerald, colors that represented both houses now united through marriage that was political alliance and genuine devotion wrapped into something that transcended either category. When she reached the altar, she looked at him with that same steady focus she had shown when entering Blackthorne in chains, waiting to see what he would choose. This time, he was choosing partnership. The ceremony was brief. Traditional vows spoken with sincerity that made them feel less like ritual and more like genuine promise. Rings exchanged. Pronouncement made that bound them legally in ways that matched what had already been true emotionally for months. Then Cassian kissed his wife, while the assembled nobility applauded and pretended they had always supported this outcome rather than spending considerable energy trying to prevent it. The reception lasted hours. Food and wine and music that transformed the Great Hall into something celebratory rather than threatening. Nobles approached offering congratulations that ranged from sincere to strategically obligatory. Ministers presented proposals for joint approval, demonstrating that the new governance structure had already become normalized. And through it all, Cassian and Serafina moved as unit, making decisions collaboratively, presenting unified front that communicated exactly what the Northern Territories could expect going forward. Shared power, joint governance, leadership that valued competence and strategic thinking over arbitrary cruelty. It was revolutionary in its mundane execution. Later, when the celebration had wound down and guests had departed and Blackthorne had returned to its usual nocturnal operations, Cassian and Serafina stood together on the balcony overlooking cliffs where storms gathered but had not yet broken. "We did it," she said quietly. "Survived the conspiracies. Reformed the governance structure. Proved that the Iron Duke could learn to share power without losing his edge. We proved something better." Cassian's arm wrapped around her waist. "We proved that devoted predators fighting together are significantly more dangerous than isolated tyrants ever could be. That caring about someone does not make you weak. It makes you absolutely lethal to anyone foolish enough to threaten what you love. Is that the lesson you want the kingdom to learn? It is the truth I learned." He pulled her closer. "That power without purpose is just cruelty. That isolation is not strength, it is slow death. That the most dangerous version of myself is not the man who trusts nothing and fears vulnerability. It is the man who found someone worth protecting and learned that devotion makes you fight harder, think sharper, and care more about outcomes beyond simple survival." So what happens now? Now we govern. We build. We create something better than what came before. We prove that the Northern Territories can function under leadership that values human connection alongside strategic efficiency. And we do it together because I finally understand what real power actually means. Serafina looked up at him with expression that held challenge and affection in equal measure. "And what does it mean?" "It means having someone beside you capable enough that sharing authority makes you stronger instead of weaker. It means building something that survives beyond your individual life, because it is founded on principles more durable than fear. It means learning that being ruthless when necessary does not require being cruel constantly. And it means accepting that the strongest rulers are not the ones who stand alone. They are the ones who find partners worthy of standing beside them." The admission was everything he had spent 15 years denying. Everything his father had taught him was weakness. Everything Serafina had proven was actually strength when exercised with intelligence and genuine care for outcomes beyond simple dominance. Storm clouds gathered above Blackthorne the way they always did, but this time Cassian watched them approach without the automatic calculation of threat assessment and defensive preparation. Because storms were just weather, and he had learned through blood and near death and the crushing weight of almost losing everything that mattered that some things were more important than perfect control. Partnership. Trust. The willingness to share power with someone competent enough to wield it responsibly. The understanding that devotion did not equal weakness when backed by demonstrated capacity for devastating violence if that devotion was threatened. The Duke and Duchess of Blackthorne stood together watching darkness approach. Neither one yielding position, neither one dominant, just two people who had learned that surviving together was better than conquering alone. And below them, the fortress that had been built to project fear began its slow transformation into something that could inspire loyalty through competence and strategic fairness rather than terror. It would take years, decades perhaps, But Cassian had time now. Had someone beside him capable of sharing the burden, had learned that the most ruthless decision he could make was choosing connection over isolation even when isolation felt safer. Because devoted predators were dangerous, but devoted partners building something together were absolutely unstoppable. The kingdom would learn that lesson eventually. And when they did, when every house understood that threatening the Duke or Duchess of Blackthorne meant facing both of them at their most lethal, the Northern Territories would enter a period of stability unprecedented in their brutal history. Not through fear alone, through the understanding that true power came from having something worth protecting and someone capable enough to help you protect it. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Seraphina's hand found his, and together they watched the storm approach with the calm certainty of people who had survived worse and would survive whatever came next. Because they had learned the most important lesson ruthless rulers could master, that strength was not about standing alone. It was about finding someone strong enough to stand beside you and building something together that neither could have created alone. This is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes only.